Across the world, museums hold objects that, at first, seem ordinary: pottery, tools, paintings, or even curious little trinkets. Yet behind them are stories far deeper than they appear. Forgotten histories, strange purposes, and mysteries that still puzzle us today. In this journey, we'll step through time, exploring relics that challenge how we see the past. Some will make us smile, others will weigh heavy with loss, and many will leave us wondering how much of history we truly understand. So settle in, let curiosity be your guide. These are not just artifacts, they are echoes of lives long gone, waiting to be remembered. Ammonite fossil. If you were to hold an ammonite fossil in your hands, it would feel cold, heavy, and solid. But the story behind it is anything but simple. What looks like a stone spiral today was once alive, moving through ancient seas that existed long before humans walked the earth. Millions of years ago, these creatures thrived in waters that no longer exist, in oceans that shifted, vanished, and left only stone as a record of their presence. The ammonite is an ancient marine mollusk, distantly related to today's squid and octopus. It had a coiled shell, usually in the shape of a spiral, divided into chambers. The animal itself lived only in the outer chamber, while the others helped it stay afloat in the sea. These chambers, once filled with gas, allowed ammonites to rise and sink in the water as if they carried their own natural submarine. Over time, they became one of the most successful species of their era. They lived for more than 300 million years, long before the rise of the dinosaurs, and survived several catastrophic events. Their fossils today can be found across the world, in cliffs, quarries, and museum shelves. Silent reminders of how life adapts, flourishes, and then disappears. But this story is not just about the creature itself. It is also about the people who discovered and studied them, and how these fossils helped us understand the hidden history of the Earth. One of the most famous figures connected to ammonites is William Smith, often called the father of English geology. In the late 18th century, Smith worked as a surveyor, mapping the land for canals and quarries. As he traveled, he began to notice something unusual. Certain layers of rock always contained the same kinds of fossils. Ammonites, in particular, became his guide. Wherever he found a certain ammonite species, he knew which layer of rock he was looking at. This simple but groundbreaking observation allowed him to create the first geological map of England, a map that changed science forever. Smith's nephew, John Phillips, continued this work and collected ammonite fossils for the Scarborough collections, where they are still preserved today, more than 2 centuries later. Imagine that, specimens carefully gathered by hand, studied under candlelight in small rooms, still resting safely in collections that we can visit now. These fossils became more than stones. They became keys to a timeline, helping us see that the Earth was far older than anyone had imagined. Holding an ammonite fossil connects you not only to an ancient ocean but also to the long chain of curiosity that stretches across generations, from the prehistoric seas where the animal once lived, to the fossilization process that preserved its shell, to the hands of the early geologists who used it to unlock Earth's story. It carries more than just a shape in stone. It carries memory. Ammonites are also tied to culture and human imagination. Their spiral form fascinated people long before science explained them. In medieval times, some believed they were petrified snakes, curled and turned to stone. In parts of England, they were called snake stones, and legends told that saints or magical forces had turned real snakes into rock. Even today, the spiral of the ammonite feels symbolic, almost like a natural work of art, a perfect repeating pattern that seems both mathematical and alive. When you look closely at the fossil, you can see the delicate lines called sutures running across the surface. These lines mark the walls between chambers, and each species had its own unique pattern. Some are simple curves, others are complex and branching, like leaves or lightning frozen in stone. These patterns fascinated collectors, and even today, each ammonite is a small puzzle of natural design. Now picture the process that brought these fossils to us. Millions of years ago, the ammonite dies and sinks to the seafloor. Soft tissues decay, leaving only the shell. Over time, layers of sediment cover it: sand, mud, and minerals slowly pressing down. Century by century, the shell hardens into rock, and the empty spaces inside fill with crystals. In some specimens, you can see shimmering minerals where the chambers once were, turning a simple shell into something that looks almost like jewelry. The patience of time is written in every fossil. The journey from a living creature to a stone artifact is not measured in years or centuries, but in millions of years. And yet here it is, resting in the palm of your hand, as if time folded and allowed the past to step quietly into the present. Ammonites finally disappeared about 66 million years ago, during the same extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs. A sudden end to creatures that had thrived for hundreds of millions of years. Their extinction reminds us that even the most successful life forms are temporary, that the Earth itself is always changing, always erasing and rewriting its history. but because their fossils are so abundant, they left behind an incredible record. Today, geologists use ammonites as index fossils, meaning they help to date the rocks around them. By identifying the species of ammonite in a layer, scientists can tell how old that layer is with remarkable precision. It is like having a natural timestamp preserved in stone. For those who wander along cliffs and beaches where ammonites are found, there is also a personal connection. Imagine walking slowly along a shoreline, the sea breeze cool, the rocks damp with spray, and then noticing a spiral embedded in the stone. You kneel, brush it gently, and realize that what you are touching is not just a rock but the remnant of a creature that lived in an ocean older than humanity itself. It is a small, quiet encounter with deep time. The ammonite fossil, then, is both scientific and deeply human. It is a story of life and extinction, of geology and discovery, of curiosity passed down from William Smith to John Phillips and beyond. It is a reminder that the world we live in is built on layers, both physical and historical, and that by studying them, we connect to stories far older than our own. As you picture this fossil, let yourself slow down. Imagine the ancient oceans, the spiral shell drifting in the water, the long passage of time that turned it into stone, and the hands of people who uncovered it centuries ago. The ammonite sits quietly, waiting, not rushing, not demanding, just existing, as it has for millions of years. And in that stillness, it offers us something rare in the modern world, a chance to pause, to breathe, and to feel the weight of time stretching endlessly behind us. Sleepp Man. Imagine the quiet countryside of North Yorkshire in the early 1800s. The air is fresh, the fields are still, and local farmers work the soil as they had done for generations. But one day, as they dug into the earth, their tools struck something unexpected. What emerged from the ground would become one of Britain's most remarkable archaeological discoveries, the skeleton of a man who had lived thousands of years earlier. He is known today as Sleepp Man. Sleepp Man is not just any skeleton. He is considered Britain's best preserved early Bronze Age individual. His bones and the context in which he was buried tell us a great deal about how people lived, what they valued, and even how they treated their dead nearly 4,000 years ago. But just as important, his discovery gives us a chance to connect with one single human being from a time that feels impossibly far away. When the farmers unearthed him in 1834, they quickly realized this was no ordinary burial. Sleepp Man had been carefully placed in a hollowed-out oak tree trunk, used as a kind of coffin. Imagine that for a moment, an enormous oak tree, cut down and split open, its trunk carved out just enough to fit a human body. Then, centuries later, when the soil was peeled back, this ancient coffin revealed a skeleton inside, still intact. The coffin itself told a story. In the Bronze Age, oak trees were symbols of strength and endurance. To be buried in an oak coffin was not a simple gesture. It suggested that this man was someone of importance, perhaps a leader, a respected elder, or even a warrior of his community. Whoever arranged his burial wanted to honor him, to preserve his memory with something both durable and sacred. Inside the coffin, alongside the skeleton, archaeologists later found grave goods. These items, tools, ornaments, and artifacts were placed with him to accompany him into the afterlife. Among the objects was a flint dagger, carefully crafted, showing skill and precision. There was also evidence of food offerings, perhaps intended to sustain him on his journey beyond life. Each of these items reminds us that the Bronze Age people had beliefs about life, death, and what might come after. Sleepp Man himself was tall for his time. Analysis of his skeleton shows he stood around 6 feet, which would have made him an impressive figure compared to others of the early Bronze Age. When the average height was much shorter, his strong bones suggest he was healthy and robust, likely living a life that required physical effort, but also one that had access to food and resources. This again hints at high status. What makes Sleepp Man even more fascinating is how well his skeleton has been preserved. Unlike many burials that crumble over time, his body survived largely intact because of the oak coffin. Oak contains tannins, natural chemicals that resist decay. Those tannins protected his remains, keeping them in remarkable condition for thousands of years. When you look at Sleepp Man today, you're not just looking at fragile, fragmented bones. You are looking at a whole person, carefully preserved by both nature and human intention. The discovery also sparked great excitement in the early 19th century. Remember, this was a time when archaeology was still a young science. People were only just beginning to understand the depth of human history. To uncover a skeleton like this, buried in such an unusual way, gave archaeologists and historians a new sense of how far back Britain's story went. Sleepp Man became a centerpiece in discussions about the Bronze Age, helping to shape the very foundations of archaeology as a discipline. Today, Sleepp Man is still studied, Modern technology, such as CT scans and isotopic analysis, has given us new insights into his life. Scientists have looked at his teeth and bones to understand what he ate. They have examined his skeleton to see signs of his health and how he may have died. Some evidence suggests that he suffered from health problems, possibly a brain tumor. If true, this might have shaped his final years and could even explain why he was buried with such care as a way of honoring a man who had suffered but was still held in respect. But beyond the science, there is something deeply human about Grieve man. When you hear about him, you realize he was not just an archaeological specimen, he was a person. He lived, he walked, he spoke, he laughed, and he probably felt the warmth of the sun just as we do. His burial shows that he was loved and remembered by his people. That is what makes his story resonate even today, nearly 4 millennia later. To imagine him is to step back into a world where life was slower yet uncertain. The Bronze Age was a time of transition, when communities began to use metal tools alongside stone, when farming was central to survival, and when societies were forming traditions that would last for centuries. Grieve man was part of that world. His grave tells us about technology, belief systems, and social structures, but it also whispers something more intimate, the story of a community that cared enough to carve a coffin from an oak tree and lay him to rest with the things that mattered most. When you think about it, discoveries like Grieve man are more than just archaeological finds. They are reminders that human lives, no matter how far in the past, were meaningful. They had beginnings and endings, struggles and joys, and even across thousands of years, that humanity remains recognizable. As you drift off now, picture the quiet resting place of Grieve man. Imagine the wooden coffin lying in the earth, sealed away for centuries. Above it, the seasons changed. Rain fell, crops grew, generations of people came and went, never knowing what lay beneath their feet. Then one day, by chance, the earth gave up its secret, and the man inside was revealed once more. Grieve man reminds us that history is not just about kings, wars, and monuments. It is also about individual lives, about one man whose people chose to honor him in a way that has allowed us to meet him again, thousands of years later. His silence speaks volumes, if only we take the time to listen. Birch bark rolls. When we think of the earliest chapters of human history, we often imagine crude tools, fire pits, and the beginnings of survival in a harsh, untamed world. But sometimes, archaeology reveals traces of sophistication and thoughtfulness that make us pause. One such discovery was made at Star Carr, a site not far from Scarborough in North Yorkshire, England. Star Carr is not just another dig site, it is considered one of the most important Mesolithic sites in Europe, often compared to Stonehenge in terms of its value for understanding ancient life. It was here that archaeologists uncovered the so-called birch bark rolls, delicate, tightly wound rolls of birch bark that have survived for over 11,000 years. At first glance, they might seem like nothing more than curled pieces of bark, but the mystery lies not in what they are made of, but in why they were made, and what they might have meant to the people who created them. Think about it. These were not random scraps of wood or bark tossed aside by chance. They were carefully cut, shaped, and rolled, suggesting that they had a specific purpose. In a world where survival was the focus, why would someone take the time to prepare and preserve such objects? Archaeologists debate their meaning. Some suggest they were containers, perhaps used to hold small items, medicinal herbs or pigments. Others believe they might have been ritual objects, connected to ceremonies or symbolic practices. After all, birch bark has a special quality. It peels in smooth sheets, it resists water, and when burned, it catches fire quickly, giving off bright flames. To Mesolithic people, it might have carried meanings of renewal, life, and transformation. Now picture Star Carr itself. Around 9000 BC, after the last ice age, this land was not the farmland and roads we see today. It was a vast wetland, filled with reeds, willows, and open water. The people who lived here were hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, tracking red deer, elk, and wild boar. And yet, they chose this spot as more than a campsite. They returned here again and again, leaving behind tools, antler headdresses, and mysterious items like the birch bark rolls. The rolls themselves are small, but their survival is extraordinary. Birch bark normally decays quickly, but because Star Carr was waterlogged, oxygen could not reach the artifacts, preserving them in remarkable condition. Without that environment, we would never even know they existed, and so the rolls whisper across time, carrying questions without answers. Were they part of a shaman's kit, perhaps carried as charms or ritual tools? Were they used to store fire-starting material, always ready for when the group needed warmth and light? Or were they symbolic, maybe even representing knowledge or memory in a culture that left no written records? What makes the birch bark rolls so haunting is not just what they are, but what they suggest. They remind us that the people of the Mesolithic were not just surviving, they were thinking, imagining, and creating meaning in their world. Their minds were not so different from ours. They wondered, they believed, they experimented, and through a few curled rolls of bark, we are given a glimpse into that inner life. Over the years, Star has continued to yield remarkable finds. Decorated antler frontlets, thought to be worn in ceremonies, flint tools shaped with care, and wooden platforms built at the lake's edge. The earliest known carpentry in Europe. Together, these discoveries paint a picture of a community that blended practicality with ritual, survival with symbolism. The birch bark rolls fit neatly into this pattern. They are small, but they speak volumes. They tell us that nothing was meaningless. Even the bark of a tree could hold significance. In a way, they force us to confront our assumptions about the past. Too often we imagine early humans as purely focused on food, shelter, and hunting. But Star shows us that meaning, ritual, and culture were there from the very beginning. Archaeologists still debate the rolls. Some say they might have been accidental, pieces of bark naturally curling. But when studied closely, the edges appear to have been deliberately trimmed. That tiny human touch separates them from nature. It makes them artifacts, not accidents. As you think of these fragile rolls lying silently in the soil for thousands of years, imagine the person who held them. Did they peel the bark from a tree with care, shaping it into something useful? Did they tuck it into a pouch, keeping it safe as they moved across the marshy land? Did they pass it to someone else, perhaps as a gift or a token in a ritual? That single action, long forgotten, left us a puzzle that still captures imaginations today. In the end, the birch bark rolls remain unsolved, objects of speculation and wonder. They remind us of how much has been lost, but also of how much still survives in fragments, waiting for us to interpret. They connect us, however faintly, to the world of 11,000 years ago, a world where a piece of bark was not just bark, but something more. And as we leave Star in our minds, we carry that question with us. What did the rolls mean? We may never know, but their mystery is exactly what keeps them alive in our imagination. They are proof that even in the earliest days of our history, humans were not only hunters or gatherers, they were dreamers, too. The climbing kit of Yorkshire's forgotten heights. Imagine standing at the edge of a windswept cliff along the Yorkshire coast. The sea crashes below you, its rhythm steady, like an endless heartbeat of the earth. The wind cuts across your face, sharp and salty, and your eyes follow the jagged drop down to the rocks. For most of us, the thought of climbing down here with nothing but a rope and a crude set of tools is more than terrifying. But in earlier centuries, and perhaps even further back in prehistory, people did exactly that. And not for adventure or thrill, they did it to survive. This curious climbing kit is a set of tools that speaks of human endurance and necessity. It was not designed for explorers chasing adrenaline. It was made for people who had no other choice but to risk their lives on the cliffs, to collect seabirds' eggs, delicacies, survival food, and trade items. When archaeologists discovered remnants of these tools, they were astonished. The materials were basic: wood, rope, bone, and leather. But the design was surprisingly clever. Pieces of twisted fibers, sometimes woven into ropes, would have been used as lifelines. Hooks, perhaps fashioned from antler or iron in later periods, were tied at the ends. Fragments of leather padding suggested that climbers wrapped their hands or feet for grip against the harsh rock. Now imagine this: a man lowering himself down, the rope biting into his waist, the salty spray hitting his body, his toes pressed against tiny holds on the cliffside. Below him, birds wheeling and crying as he nears their nests. With one hand he clings desperately, with the other, he reaches for the eggs, carefully placing them into a pouch, knowing that one slip could mean the end. For us today, it feels unthinkable, but in a world without supermarkets, seabird eggs were a precious source of protein and fat. In many coastal communities, they were the difference between hunger and survival. The Yorkshire cliffs, with their towering faces, were not just landscapes to admire. They were larders. They were vertical hunting grounds, and the climbing kit shows us how far human ingenuity and desperation could go. The idea of egg collecting might sound small, but its importance runs deep. In archaeology, small objects often tell the loudest stories. A crude rope fragment doesn't just tell us how people climbed. It tells us about entire traditions of risk, ritual, and survival. These kits hint at communities who trained their youth to scale cliffs, who passed down techniques and skills. Perhaps songs were sung before dangerous climbs. Perhaps rituals were performed, asking protection from the spirits of the sea. And think about the psychology. To lower yourself into such danger, again and again, knowing others had fallen, knowing the sea swallowed many before you. This wasn't just physical toughness. It required courage that feels almost alien to us now. Some historians suggest that egg collecting wasn't just about survival. It might have had ceremonial value. In many cultures, eggs are symbols of life, rebirth, and the cycles of nature. Could it be that seabird eggs carried spiritual meaning for ancient coastal communities? Maybe certain eggs were offered at feasts or buried in sacred sites. It's difficult to prove, but the possibility lingers like an echo. When we step back, this climbing kit also connects to a much broader story: how humans everywhere turned landscapes into resources. Where mountains, seas, or cliffs seemed hostile, people found ways to adapt. In Norway, Iceland, and Scotland, similar cliff climbing traditions existed. Men dangled from ropes, sometimes for hours, gathering eggs, or even capturing young birds. It was deadly, but it was also normal. So the kit from Yorkshire is not just about a single community. It is part of a universal human trait: our relentless push to make every environment, no matter how dangerous, part of our survival strategy. Archaeologists studying these kits often reflect on the silence of the cliffs. The tools are mute, but the imagination fills in the missing soundscape: the rope creaking, the shouts of men above, the gulls crying in alarm, the waves booming below. Holding one of those ancient fragments, you can almost hear the echoes of those long-gone climbers. Today the idea might make us shiver. We live in an age of safety harnesses, helmets, and modern gear, but back then a simple rope and hand-fashioned kit was enough. Enough to trust your life upon, enough to feed your family, enough to keep traditions alive. Think too of the human cost. How many fell? How many families stood above, waiting for the climber who never returned? These untold tragedies are also hidden inside the story of the climbing kit. Yet there's also admiration. These were people who looked at sheer rock faces and said, "We will not be defeated by this." In that sense, the climbing kit is not just a survival tool. It is a symbol of human stubbornness, of refusing to give in, even when the odds seemed impossible. When we visit the Yorkshire coast today, we might just see dramatic scenery, a place for photographs, a destination for tourists. But if you look closely, if you let your mind drift, you can almost picture those ancient climbers suspended between sea and sky, risking it all for survival, and that's what makes this humble climbing kit extraordinary. Not the materials, not the shape, but the story it holds, the story of ordinary people, long forgotten, whose bravery fed entire communities, and whose lives were tied, quite literally, to a fragile rope against the vastness of the sea. Kirkdale Cave. If you ever drive through the quiet valleys of North Yorkshire, surrounded by rolling green fields and the hum of distant streams, you might never suspect that beneath the soil lies one of the most fascinating and controversial archaeological sites of Britain. It doesn't look like much on the surface, just another countryside, dotted with farms, villages, and winding roads, but hidden within the land, under layers of limestone, there is a cave that once forced both scientists and the church to reconsider what they thought they knew about Earth's history. This is the story of Kirkdale Cave. In the early 1800s, workers in the Vale of Pickering stumbled upon something strange. While quarrying for limestone, they uncovered bones, lots of them. At first glance, these didn't look unusual. Farmers and laborers sometimes found old animal remains when cutting into the earth. But soon, more discoveries emerged. Among the bones were parts of a red deer's antler, teeth from a horse, and most strangely, the teeth of an animal that no longer roams Britain, the rhinoceros. Imagine for a moment what that must have felt like. You're a quarry worker in rural Yorkshire, in an age when the world felt much smaller, much more familiar. You know the countryside, you know the animals that graze the fields, cows, sheep, horses, maybe even the occasional wild deer. But a rhinoceros? That belongs to faraway lands, the kind you only read about in travel accounts or hear mentioned in hushed tones from sailors returning from distant colonies. To hold the teeth of such a creature in your hands, pulled from the earth of your own village, must have seemed almost impossible. Word of the discovery spread, and soon scholars and scientists began to take notice. The early 19th century was a time of great intellectual tension. Science was beginning to challenge long-held beliefs, particularly those rooted in the church. The age of the earth, the history of life, and the story of creation itself were under debate. Many still believed in a world just a few thousand years old, shaped by a single biblical flood. But the bones from Kirkdale Cave did not fit neatly into that narrative. As more careful excavations took place, it became clear that the cave wasn't just a place where a few animals had died by chance. It was littered with remains. Hyenas, lions, elephants, hippopotamuses, bison, and many others had once passed through here. The cave floor was packed with bones gnawed, broken, and scattered, as if some great predator had dragged its meals inside. And that predator, it turned out, was the hyena. This revelation was stunning. Hyenas in Yorkshire? Today we think of them as animals of the African savanna, scavenging and hunting under the burning sun. But thousands of years ago, during warmer periods of the Ice Age, hyenas thrived in Britain. They hunted large animals, dragged their prey into caves, and left behind evidence of a lost ecosystem. Kirkdale Cave became one of the most important sites to prove this. But here's the twist. In the early 1800s, not everyone welcomed this explanation. The church favored the view that the bones had been deposited during Noah's flood. According to this idea, the great waters had swept animals from distant lands into Yorkshire, leaving their remains scattered in the cave. For those who wanted the world to align with biblical chronology, this was an easy solution. The animals didn't really belong here. They had been washed in by divine forces. Scientists, however, were starting to notice details that didn't fit that explanation. The bones weren't arranged like flood debris. They showed tooth marks, breakage, and patterns of digestion consistent with predators. The more evidence was examined, the clearer it became. The cave wasn't a graveyard of the flood, it was a den, and the den belonged to Ice Age hyenas. This conclusion shook the scientific community. It was one of the earliest cases in Britain where fossils directly challenged the prevailing religious interpretation of Earth's history. The discoveries at Kirkdale Cave helped establish the idea that Britain's landscape had once looked very different. It hadn't always been the calm farmland of sheep and plows. It had been a wilderness where massive creatures roamed freely, hunted by fierce predators. Picture the scene in your mind: the Yorkshire valleys during a warm interglacial period of the Ice Age. Rivers cutting through lush forests, herds of elephants grazing in the lowlands, hippopotamuses wallowing in slow-moving waters, bison and horses moving across open plains, and, in the shadows, packs of hyenas waiting for their moment, ready to drag their prey into the shelter of Kirkdale Cave. It's almost unimaginable today, but the bones prove it beyond doubt. One of the most influential voices in studying Kirkdale Cave was William Buckland, a geologist and clergyman. Buckland published a detailed account in 1821, describing the cave as a hyena den. He examined the bones, the teeth marks, and the patterns of wear, and compared them to modern hyena behavior. His work was groundbreaking. It was one of the first scientific studies to use comparative anatomy to reconstruct ancient environments. And yet, Buckland himself still tried to reconcile his findings with the flood narrative, at least partially. This reflected the broader struggle of the time, scientists trying to uncover truths about the Earth's deep past while still living in a world dominated by religious explanations. Kirkdale Cave sat right at the heart of that struggle. Today, when we visit the site, it might seem quiet, even unremarkable. The bones have long since been removed to museums. The cave itself is closed off, protected as a site of scientific importance. But if you stand nearby and imagine the world as it once was, you can almost hear the echoes of an ancient night, the laughter-like calls of hyenas, the trumpeting of mammoths, the crashing of antlers as red deer fought for dominance. What Kirkdale Cave teaches us is not only about the animals that lived here, but also about the way humans come to understand the past. For centuries, people thought Britain had always looked more or less the same. The idea of exotic animals roaming Yorkshire seemed absurd, but evidence doesn't lie. Bones, teeth, and antlers spoke a truth that contradicted the old beliefs, and slowly, society had to adapt. The discovery at Kirkdale was more than just a collection of fossils. It was a turning point in how science and faith negotiated their boundaries. It was part of a broader shift that would eventually lead to Darwin's theory of evolution and our modern understanding of geology. From a quiet cave in Yorkshire came evidence that the Earth was far older, far stranger, and far more dynamic than anyone had previously imagined. As we drift through this story, allow yourself to think about the deep time hidden beneath our feet. Think of how many other caves, fields, and rivers still hold secrets waiting to be uncovered. The world we know is just a snapshot, a thin moment in the long unfolding of history. Beneath every hill and valley lies the memory of lost worlds, waiting for someone to listen. Kirkdale Cave reminds us that the Earth itself is a storyteller. Its bones and stones carry tales of climates, creatures, and conflicts that predate us by hundreds of thousands of years. All we have to do is pay attention. And so, as the wind drifts over the Yorkshire hills tonight, the cave rests in silence. The hyenas are long gone, the elephants no longer roam, and the rhinoceroses will never return to this valley. But their story lives on. In museums, in books, and in the imagination of anyone willing to look at a simple bone and ask, what really happened here, long before us? The doll. From plaything to powerful symbol. When most people today think of a doll, they picture a child's toy, perhaps something soft and cuddly, or a small plastic figure with a painted smile and a brightly colored dress. But dolls have a much longer and more complex history than that. Far from being just innocent playthings, they were once objects of power, art, and ritual. To truly understand their story, we have to travel back thousands of years, to the earliest human societies, and explore why these small human-like figures held such importance across so many different cultures. Archaeologists have uncovered dolls made of clay, wood, ivory, and even stone from ancient settlements. Some of the oldest examples date back more than 4,000 years, discovered in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. These figures were often found in graves, placed alongside the dead, it suggests they were more than toys. Perhaps they acted as companions for the afterlife. Or maybe they were intended as offerings, holding symbolic meaning that we can only guess at today. In ancient Egypt, dolls carved from wood or shaped from clay have been found in children's burials. Some had movable limbs or beads strung as hair, carefully crafted with the same care you might expect for a much larger sculpture. At first glance, they might look like simple toys, but their placement in tombs suggests they carried spiritual significance. Egyptian society was deeply spiritual, and the boundary between play, ritual, and belief was often blurred. A doll could comfort a child in life, but in death, it might serve as a spiritual protector. Moving forward in time, the Greeks and Romans also created dolls, often from terracotta or bone. Girls in these societies would receive dolls as young children, and when they came of age, they were expected to dedicate their dolls to a goddess, often Artemis in Greece or Venus in Rome. This act symbolized the transition from childhood into adulthood. The doll was not just a toy, but a marker of life stages, almost like a ritual object tied to the identity of the person who owned it. Some dolls, however, were not linked to childhood at all. Instead, they were tied to religion and even magic. In ancient civilizations, small human-like figures were sometimes used in ceremonies to represent deities, ancestors, or even enemies. A doll could be used as a stand-in for a person during rituals, sometimes in acts of healing, other times in acts of harm. It's not hard to see how the idea of the voodoo doll, much later in history, might have grown out of such traditions. Even in Europe during the Middle Ages, small figures were occasionally used in folk practices, thought to influence fertility, protection, or fortune. But it wasn't always dark or spiritual. Dolls have also been works of art. In Japan, for instance, beautifully crafted dolls have been central to festivals for centuries. The famous Hina dolls are displayed every spring during the Festival of Girls' Day, carefully dressed in traditional costumes representing the imperial court. These dolls are not playthings at all. They are treasured cultural symbols, passed down through generations, holding deep cultural meaning and a sense of continuity. In other cultures, dolls were tied to survival itself. In indigenous traditions across North America, for example, some dolls were made from corn husks or leather. These were often given to children, but they also served as teaching tools, helping to pass down values, beliefs, and practical skills from one generation to the next. A child playing with a doll might have been imitating the work of a parent, learning about their role within the community in a hands-on way. When we step back, we begin to see dolls not as simple objects, but as reflections of the societies that made them. They can represent religion, culture, art, and even power. They could comfort a child, symbolize adulthood, or act as tools in sacred rituals. And across all these roles, one thing remains clear: dolls hold meaning far deeper than we tend to imagine today. By the time we reach the early modern period, dolls start to look more familiar. In Europe, particularly from the 16th and 17th centuries onward, dolls were not just children's toys, but were also used to display fashion. Before photography and mass production, dolls dressed in the latest styles were sent across countries to showcase clothing trends. Aristocratic families could look to these miniature mannequins to see the latest cuts, colors, and designs before commissioning similar outfits. In that sense, dolls became tools of communication, carrying ideas of culture and style across borders. During the Industrial Revolution, dolls shifted again. Factories made it possible to mass-produce dolls, and suddenly they became accessible to children of all classes. Porcelain dolls, with glass eyes and delicate painted features, became prized possessions. Many were so carefully made that they are collected today as historical artifacts. At the same time, however, the industrial production of dolls also created a clear divide. On one side, dolls for play, and on the other, dolls as collectibles or artistic objects. Even in the modern era, dolls continue to carry deeper layers of meaning than we might think. They can reflect ideals of beauty, culture, or identity. For example, dolls have often mirrored society's expectations, for better or worse. They can shape the way children imagine themselves and others, influencing their perception of gender, race, and culture. In recent decades, there has been much debate over how dolls reflect reality and whether they present healthy or harmful ideals. If we trace this long journey, we see that the doll is one of humanity's oldest cultural companions. They have been made in almost every material, by almost every culture, and for almost every purpose: play, ritual, teaching, art, and even magic. That is why the history of dolls is not just about toys. It is about how humans see themselves, how they pass on beliefs, and how they imagine their place in the world. When you look at a doll today, whether it's an ancient wooden figure in a museum or a plastic toy on a store shelf, you are seeing the latest chapter in a story that stretches back thousands of years. A story where the line between play and ritual, between innocence and symbolism, is not always so clear. And in that sense, dolls are far more than objects. They are mirrors of human life. carrying forward the hopes, fears, and values of the people who made and cherished them. The Old Fish Market, Scarborough. Imagine walking into a room where an old painting hangs on the wall. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. Its colors have faded with time, the brushstrokes are soft, almost blurred, and the canvas itself seems tired from decades of existence. Many people might pass it by without a second look. But if you stop, if you let your eyes settle on it for longer than a passing moment, you begin to notice something. This is not just any painting. This is the Old Fish Market of Scarborough, a work that carries the weight of stories, lives, and traditions that once defined an entire coastal community. Scarborough is a place many in Britain know today as a seaside town, a spot for holidays, fish and chips, sandy beaches, and the sound of slot machines by the promenade. But centuries ago, long before the arcades and vacationers, Scarborough was something very different. It was one of the busiest fishing ports on the Yorkshire coast, and the heart of that trade, that bustling life, was the fish market. The painting shows us a moment in time, a glimpse of the market as it once was. You can almost hear the cries of fishmongers calling out prices, the clatter of wooden crates being dragged across damp stone floors, the laughter of children darting between stalls, and above it all, the salty breeze of the North Sea rolling in. The painting captures not only a place, but the spirit of a community bound by the rhythm of the tides. But what makes this painting so special isn't only the brushwork or the scene it depicts, it's the history behind it, the untold stories of the fishermen, their families, and the market that kept Scarborough alive for centuries. Think for a moment about the life of a fisherman in Scarborough 200 years ago. Before dawn, when the rest of the town still slept, men would head down to the harbor. The boats were small, often just cobbles, traditional fishing boats with flat bottoms, perfect for the choppy waters of the North Sea. They would push off into the dark, the cold biting their skin, the waves unpredictable, and the hope of a good catch ahead. Every journey was a gamble. The North Sea is beautiful, but it has never been kind. Storms could rise quickly, and not all men who left in the morning returned by nightfall. Back on land, the fish market waited. The women of the town, wives, daughters, and mothers of the fishermen, often played as important a role as the men themselves. They stood at the stalls, ready to sell the day's catch. Cod, haddock, herring, mackerel, all fresh, sometimes still glistening with seawater, laid out on wooden tables. The market wasn't just about trade, it was about survival. The money earned from selling those fish kept food on the table, paid for boots, and allowed families to endure through harsh winters. And the painting, though still and silent, holds all of that within its frame. When we look closer, we also begin to see how Scarborough's Old Fish Market wasn't only an economic hub, it was also a social one. People gathered there not only to buy and sell, but to talk, to share news, to gossip. Imagine the conversations. News of a shipwreck off the coast, rumors of prices rising in London, whispers about politics, or simply the latest stories of neighbors. The market was a heartbeat, pulsing with the everyday lives of the people who lived there. Now let's consider the artist. Why did they paint this? Was it nostalgia? Was it an attempt to capture a way of life that was already beginning to disappear? By the 19th century, fishing was changing. Larger boats were beginning to dominate. Railways were connecting towns like Scarborough to major cities. Suddenly, fish from the Yorkshire coast could be transported inland quickly, changing the way markets operated. And with progress came loss. The old ways, the local traditions, began to fade. Perhaps the artists sensed this. Perhaps they looked at the fish market and knew that one day it would be gone, and so they captured it on canvas, freezing it in time for us to witness centuries later. The painting might not dazzle with gold frames or dramatic scenes of kings and queens, but it carries something even more valuable: authenticity. It shows ordinary life, which in many ways is more important than any grand historical moment, because it is through the ordinary that we truly understand how people lived, worked, and dreamed. Let's imagine ourselves stepping into that market. You can hear the gulls overhead, circling and screeching, waiting for scraps. The cobbled ground is damp and uneven beneath your feet. The smell is powerful, salty, fishy, with a hint of smoke from chimneys nearby. A woman in a shawl is haggling with a customer, her voice strong and determined. A boy runs past carrying a basket of herring, the fish slipping dangerously close to tumbling out. A fisherman leans against a post, his clothes worn, his hands rough, his face lined by years of sea air and hard labor. This is the living, breathing Scarborough that the painting whispers to us. But the fish market wasn't only about Scarborough itself, it was connected to something bigger. The North Sea trade linked ports all across Europe. Fish caught in Scarborough could end up in markets far from the Yorkshire coast, and likewise goods from other places found their way into Scarborough's stalls. The town wasn't isolated, it was part of a network, a web of trade that spanned countries and cultures. Yet with all of this movement and trade, there was also fragility. Scarborough's market depended on the sea, and the sea was unpredictable. Bad weather could mean no fish. Overfishing could deplete stocks. Wars at sea could disrupt trade routes. And through it all, the people of Scarborough had to adapt, to bend with the changes, to survive. Today, when we look at the painting, we might feel a kind of quiet sadness. The market it shows is no longer the same. The old fish market, as it once was, has faded, replaced by modern shops and changing times. But the painting remains. It is like a doorway, a passage into another world. A reminder that what we take for granted today, supermarkets, refrigeration, transportation, was once unimaginable. That a simple fish, laid out on a wooden table, could carry with it the labor of men at sea, the resilience of women at market, and the lifeblood of a community. And this is why the painting is more than just a tired-looking piece of art. It is a story, it is memory, it is history told not through grand battles or kings, but through everyday life, the kind of life that built towns, sustained families, and shaped the culture of entire regions. When we pause in front of it, we are not only looking at brushstrokes on canvas, we are listening to voices that are no longer here, footsteps that no longer echo across cobbles, and a way of life that has passed into memory. And in that quiet moment, we understand why this painting matters. It is not about beauty in the traditional sense. It is about presence, about remembering the ordinary lives that gave Scarborough its soul. So next time you walk past an old painting in a gallery, one that doesn't seem to stand out at first glance, take a moment to stop, look closely, ask yourself what stories it holds. Because sometimes, the most unassuming works are the ones that carry the greatest treasures, and the old fish market of Scarborough is one of those treasures. Powderhorn. When you step into a gallery filled with the relics of centuries past, some objects may appear small or even modest at first glance. But if you pause long enough, if you let your eyes settle on them, you realize they hold far more than their physical form suggests. The powderhorn on display at Scarborough Art Gallery is one such object. At first sight, it looks like a simple, curved container, carved from an animal's horn, fitted with a stopper, and polished smooth by time. Yet within this vessel lies the memory of a world that was both practical and perilous, a time when survival depended on tools, and every object carried layers of meaning. The powderhorn dates back to the 18th century, an age marked by exploration, colonial expansion, warfare, and the transformation of societies. To understand it, we must place ourselves in the shoes of the men and women who lived in that world. Guns were no longer rare, but they were still fragile and temperamental devices. Muskets and pistols relied on black powder, and without a container to carry and protect that powder, the weapon was useless. The powderhorn became indispensable, functional, portable, and often beautifully decorated. What makes this Scarborough example fascinating is that it is not merely a tool, it is also a work of art. Powderhorns were often carved with images, initials, dates, or intricate designs. Some carried maps, etched into their surface, a reminder of journeys or battles. Others bore the names of their owners, signaling both pride and the practical need to identify one's belongings in a camp or garrison. To own a powderhorn was to carry not just powder, but also a piece of your identity. The use of animal horn, often from oxen or cattle, was no accident. Horn was lightweight, durable, and naturally curved, making it an ideal material to hold powder. The hollow interior could be easily scraped clean, polished, and shaped. Once finished, the horn was fitted with wooden plugs at either end, and sometimes with metal mounts. The wider end might be sealed permanently, while the narrower tip had a small opening for pouring powder, usually fitted with a stopper. Hunters, soldiers, and explorers carried these horns slung at their sides, always within reach, for without them the musket was nothing more than an awkward piece of wood and metal. Yet beyond their practical use, powder horns became canvases for expression. Imagine a soldier stationed far from home, enduring the monotony of camp life. With a knife in hand, he might carve his name, a date, or a small image into his powder horn. Over weeks and months these horns became diaries, etched in bone, silent companions that held stories only their owners could fully understand. Some showed scenes of battles, fortresses, or ships. Others displayed animals, flowers, or geometric patterns. The Scarborough powder horn, though simple at first glance, would have carried such layers of meaning for the person who once relied upon it daily. The history of the powder horn also intersects with larger narratives of the 18th century. This was an age of empire, when Britain's influence stretched across the seas. Soldiers carried powder horns in North America during the French and Indian War, on European battlefields during the 7 Years' War, and across colonies where muskets were both tools of defense and symbols of authority. Powder horns accompanied pioneers who ventured into forests and plains, where hunting was essential for survival. Each horn tells us not only about its owner, but also about the wider world they inhabited. a world of danger, opportunity, and constant change. Think of the daily ritual of using one. A hunter, moving quietly through a wooded landscape, pauses when he hears a sound. He lowers his musket, reaches for the horn, and carefully pours black powder into the barrel. The powder must stay dry, so the horn is kept sealed until this moment. One mistake, one spark at the wrong time, could mean disaster. The horn's shape, curved and smooth, makes it easy to handle even in the cold. The hunter then loads the shot, primes the pan, and prepares to fire. Every step depends on that simple horn hanging at his side. At the same time, powder horns reflected the personal and cultural identities of their makers and owners. Some were commissioned from skilled artisans, who decorated them with elaborate designs. Others were crafted at home, plain but deeply personal. They could be gifts, passed down between generations, or trophies of war. Holding one in your hands is to feel the weight of history, not heavy in the sense of mass, but heavy in the sense of meaning. The Scarborough example reminds us that objects in museums are never silent. They speak, if we know how to listen. They whisper about the lives of ordinary people, soldiers, hunters, and families, whose names may not appear in history books but whose daily struggles shaped the world. The powder horn bridges the gap between the battlefield and the hearth, between necessity and creativity. And in its quiet way, it also invites us to think about the fragility of the past. Gunpowder itself was unstable, dangerous, and transformative. It changed warfare forever, altering the balance of power across continents. The powder horn, humble though it may seem, was part of that story. Without it, the musket could not function, and without muskets, the armies and empires of the 18th century would have looked very different indeed. When you stand before it today, encased in the safety of a gallery display, the powder horn feels worlds away from the smoky battlefields and forests where it was once used. Yet the object still holds traces of those moments. The faint marks of carving, the smooth polish from being handled, the silent testimony of survival. It may be centuries old, but it is not lifeless. It carries with it the echoes of men who once depended on it, who carved their hopes, fears, and memories into its surface. The next time you encounter such an object, let your mind slow down. Think of the hands that held it, the environments where it was carried, the histories it silently endured. A powder horn is more than just a container for black powder. It is a vessel of memory, a link between past and present, and a reminder that even the smallest artifacts can hold entire worlds within them. Rose chafer beetles. At first glance, it might surprise you to know that something as small as a beetle could captivate collectors, historians, and naturalists for centuries. The rose chafer beetle, with its shimmering wings and jewel-like appearance, is not simply an insect among many. It is a tiny treasure of the natural world. Found across much of southern and central Europe, this beetle has fascinated both ordinary people and scholars alike. Its place in the Scarborough Museum's and Galleries collection allows us to look closer, not only at the insect itself, but also at the long story of humanity's relationship with the natural world. When you look at the rose chafer, the first thing you notice is the color. It doesn't simply appear green. Depending on how the light strikes its wings, the beetle can appear golden, metallic, or almost emerald in its brilliance. This iridescence is not from pigment, but from the way light bends and scatters off microscopic structures on the beetle's wings. In this sense, the rose chafer is a living gemstone, created not by miners or craftsmen, but by nature itself. That jewel-like quality is one of the reasons these beetles were so highly admired in collections. They looked almost too perfect to be real, as though someone had carefully crafted them in a workshop rather than found them in a garden. These beetles were commonly spotted in meadows, gardens, and hedgerows, particularly during the summer months when roses and other flowers were in bloom. They feed on nectar and pollen, making them an active part of the ecosystem, pollinating plants as they move about. To gardeners of the past, they may have been both a wonder and at times a nuisance, as their presence could be seen in abundance on flower heads. Yet to collectors and naturalists, they were an emblem of the rich biodiversity of the land, a reminder of the intricate balance between plant and insect life. The inclusion of rose chafer beetles in museum collections like Scarborough's reflects a much larger story about the rise of natural history as a discipline. In the 18th and 19th centuries, collecting insects was not merely a hobby. It was a way to engage with science, with the expanding knowledge of the natural world that was sweeping through Europe. Cabinets of curiosity, often displayed in the homes of wealthy individuals, would include beetles pinned carefully in rows, their wings spread to catch the light. Some collections would include hundreds, even thousands of specimens, each identified, labeled, and admired not just for their scientific value but also for their beauty. To hold a rose chafer in a collection was to hold a fragment of nature's artistry. And yet, unlike gemstones or metals extracted from the ground, beetles are fragile, fleeting. Their delicate wings could crumble, their bodies break if not preserved carefully. That fragility gives them a special place in natural history museums today. Seeing them behind glass, perfectly intact, you are reminded of how easily such small wonders can vanish from the living world. The rose chafer is also a beetle of stories. Across Europe, insects with shimmering wings often carried symbolism. They were associated with transformation, with fleeting beauty, with the mystery of how something so small could shine so brightly. Some collectors believed that insects like these demonstrated the perfection of nature's design, proof of a world crafted with purpose. Others simply admired them as rare jewels, each beetle representing a fragment of exotic wonder in an otherwise ordinary landscape. At Scarborough, the rose chafer beetles in the collection remind us of the work of generations of curators and collectors. Someone long ago saw these creatures, recognized their uniqueness, and decided they were worth preserving. Perhaps it was a naturalist walking through a meadow who noticed their wings glimmering in the sun. Perhaps it was a collector who saw them as essential additions to a cabinet already filled with butterflies, shells, and minerals. Whatever their reason, that decision ensured that today, hundreds of years later, we can still look upon these beetles and marvel at them. The beauty of the rose chafer lies not just in its appearance, but also in its connection to the larger history of human curiosity. These insects traveled from field to drawer, from collector's case to museum display, carrying with them the memory of the times they lived in. In a way, they are more than specimens, they are records of the past, silent witnesses to the way people once viewed the natural world. To stand in the Scarborough museums and galleries, looking at these beetles behind glass, is to look at a piece of history frozen in time. The shimmering colors you see today are the same ones that shone in a meadow 2 centuries ago. The same play of light that dazzled an 18th century naturalist still dazzles us today. That continuity is part of what makes them so compelling. And beyond their beauty, rose chafers remind us of the fragility of ecosystems. Insects play a vital role in pollination and the maintenance of plant life. Without them, the landscapes of Europe, and indeed the world, would be entirely different. The preservation of these beetles in collections is not just about celebrating their beauty. It is also about remembering the essential role they played, and still play, in sustaining life. In this way, the rose chafer beetle is both a natural wonder and a cultural artifact. Its place in Scarborough's collection bridges the gap between science, art, and history. It is not only admired for its form, but also studied for what it can tell us about biodiversity, about the ways people collected and classified nature, and about the enduring human fascination with the natural world. When you leave the display, perhaps you will carry with you a sense of just how extraordinary even the smallest parts of nature can be. Something as tiny as a beetle can open a window onto centuries of history, connecting the meadows of Europe with the glass cases of a museum. In its shimmering wings lies a reminder that beauty is not always found in the grand or the monumental. Sometimes it rests quietly in the fragile body of a beetle, preserved against time, waiting for us to notice. Ushabti. When archaeologists open an ancient Egyptian tomb, the sight can be overwhelming. Beyond the sarcophagus, the painted walls, and the offerings of food and jewelry, there is often something far more numerous, tiny figures, carved with care, resting in neat rows, or scattered across the floor. These are the ushabti, small funerary figurines, that accompanied the dead into the afterlife. At first glance they might appear like simple trinkets, but to the ancient Egyptians, their purpose carried great weight. Ushabti, sometimes called shabtis or shawabtis depending on the period, were meant to serve as substitutes for the deceased in the afterlife. The belief was that when the gods called upon the dead to perform labor in the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise, the ushabti would answer instead, sparing the tomb's owner from work. They were essentially helpers beyond death, standing in for the individual they were buried with. Most ushabtis were small, ranging from just a few inches to the size of a hand. They were mass-produced in many cases, with some tombs containing hundreds or even thousands of them. Imagine opening a chamber and finding the ground covered with these figures. Every one of them a promise that the tomb owner would not have to labor in eternity. For wealthy Egyptians, entire armies of ushabti might be buried, creating the sense of a workforce ready at command. The materials varied. Some ushabtis were carved from wood or stone, while others were molded from faience, a type of bright, glazed ceramic that often shimmered in blue or green. These colors were not random choices. They symbolized rebirth, regeneration, and the fertile power of the Nile. To hold one of these ushabti today is to see a flash of that ancient symbolism, a reminder of the cycle of life and death the Egyptians believed in so strongly. The inscriptions on many ushabtis are especially fascinating. Often they bear lines from the Book of the Dead, spells written to ensure that the figurine would come to life when needed. The Great Auk Egg, a silent testament to extinction. Imagine walking into a quiet gallery. The air feels still, almost reverent. In front of you, inside a mahogany case fitted with glass panels, rests an egg. At first glance, it looks delicate, almost fragile, cushioned gently in a nest of soft cotton wool. But this is not just any egg. It is the egg of the great auk, a seabird once abundant across the northern Atlantic Ocean. A bird that no longer exists today. What you are seeing is not merely an object, it is the final whisper of a species, a reminder of how easily human actions can erase life from the earth. The great auk was once a familiar presence along the coasts of Newfoundland, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Scotland, and northern Europe. Standing nearly 3 feet tall, it was striking, black feathers on its back, white on its belly, and a proud curved beak. Though it looked similar to the penguins we know today, it was not closely related. The great auk was, in fact, the original penguin, long before explorers gave that name to the flightless birds of the southern hemisphere. The great auk had small wings that could not support flight in the air, but they were perfectly adapted for swimming, making the bird an agile diver that hunted fish with speed and precision. For centuries, coastal communities relied on the great auk as a source of food, oil, and feathers. The birds bred in dense colonies on remote islands where they laid their eggs on open ground. Their lack of fear of humans combined with their inability to fly made them an easy target. Sailors could simply walk into a nesting site, pick up the birds, and carry them away. Eggs were gathered by the thousands, and adults were slaughtered for meat or burned as fuel for fires on ships. The egg before us today, carefully displayed in its case, represents the tragic culmination of that story. It is large, speckled, and unique. No two great auk eggs were alike, each marked with its own pattern of spots and lines. Collectors in the 18th and 19th centuries prized them not only for their rarity, but also for their beauty. As the great auk became scarcer, its eggs became even more valuable, fetching extraordinary prices in private collections. Ironically, this very desire to preserve the memory of the bird by keeping its eggs in cabinets of curiosity hastened its extinction. By the early 1800s, the great auk was in steep decline. Nesting colonies once teeming with thousands of birds dwindled to a few small groups. Hunters and traders knew their value and targeted them relentlessly. In 1844, on a small rocky island called Elde, off the coast of Iceland, the last known breeding pair of great auks was killed by sailors. Their single egg was accidentally crushed underfoot during the struggle, and just like that, a species that had survived for thousands of years was gone forever. The egg in this case, then, is not simply a scientific specimen, it is a relic of a vanished world. It speaks to us in silence, telling a story of human greed, short-sightedness, and the irreversible consequences of overexploitation. Now, let us imagine the journey of this single egg, once laid on the bare stone of a windswept island, perhaps cradled briefly by the warmth of its parent. It was stolen, removed from its natural place, and eventually acquired by collectors who understood its increasing rarity. Unlike many other eggs which were broken or lost, this one survived. Today it sits in Scarborough's collection, preserved not just as a curiosity, but as a warning. Standing before it, one might reflect on the strange irony of its survival. The great auk is gone, but the egg remains. It has become more than an object, it is a symbol. A reminder of how quickly abundance can vanish. A reminder of how human actions, unchecked, can silence entire species. And also perhaps a quiet invitation for us to look inward and ask what lessons we have learned. The great auk's extinction is not an isolated event. It belongs to a much larger pattern of human behavior. We see echoes of this story in the fate of the passenger pigeon in North America, which once filled the skies in flocks so vast they darkened the sun, only to be hunted into extinction by the early 20th century. We see it in the Tasmanian tiger, or thylacine, destroyed by bounty hunters in Australia. We even see it today in animals like the vaquita porpoise, or the pangolin, teetering on the edge of survival because of human demand. And yet, in the great auk egg, there is also a strange sense of resilience. Though the bird itself is gone, its memory survives, etched into the speckled patterns of this fragile shell, remembered in the records of naturalists, and whispered in the halls of museums. It is as if the egg continues to speak for the bird, carrying its story forward through time. Visitors who pause before it may feel many things: sorrow, curiosity, perhaps even guilt on behalf of humanity. But they may also feel wonder. Wonder at the fact that such a bird once lived, that oceans once echoed with its cries, that islands once teemed with its colonies. And wonder, too, that something as small as an egg can carry within it the weight of an entire species' history. If you were to hold it, which you cannot, you might notice its surprising size, the smoothness of its shell, the unique markings that make it unlike any other egg. You might think about the chick that never hatched, the life that never lived, and the countless others that were snuffed out in similar ways. In that moment, the egg becomes not just an object in a case, but a vessel of memory, a link between past and present. The great auk egg forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that extinction is permanent. Once a species is gone, it cannot return. No matter how much we regret, no matter how carefully we preserve what remains, the living bird itself will never again swim through the Atlantic currents or lay its eggs on the cliffs. This is why the egg feels both precious and heartbreaking. It is a reminder of something we lost and can never regain. And so, in this chapter of our journey, we are not only learning about an object in a museum, we are engaging with a story of responsibility. The great auk egg is not a relic of a distant past, disconnected from our lives. It is a warning from history, a message that abundance can vanish, that what seems eternal can disappear in the blink of an eye. Perhaps the best way to honor the great auk is not only to remember it, but to take its story to heart, to recognize that other species today stand where it once stood, vulnerable, unprotected, and facing pressures from human activity. The egg then becomes a call to action, not through loud protest, but through quiet reflection. As you continue to picture this fragile egg in its glass case, imagine the silence it represents, the silence of a species gone, and imagine the responsibility it places upon us to ensure that silence does not deepen with more losses in the future. The great auk will never return, but its egg remains, a symbol, a memory, a fragile reminder that the choices of humans can shape the fate of the living world. Puffin. If you have ever stood on the high, wind-swept cliffs of Yorkshire in the summertime, you may have seen a little flash of black and white with a beak so bright it almost looks painted. These are puffins, small seabirds that at first glance might seem almost cartoon-like, but in truth, they are remarkable creatures that have quietly endured for centuries. Watching them is like being let in on a secret part of the natural world, one that feels fragile yet timeless. What makes the puffin so fascinating is that it seems both familiar and strange. To some, it looks like a tiny parrot dressed in a tuxedo. Its beak glows with bright orange and red in the breeding season, and its comical little walk across the cliffs often draws smiles. But beneath this light-hearted appearance lies a bird whose life story is deeply tied to the harshness of the sea, the shifting winds, and the rhythms of survival. On the Yorkshire coast, one of the strongest colonies can be found at Bempton Cliffs. Standing there, you can see hundreds of seabirds circling, but when you catch sight of a puffin bobbing on the waves or diving into the sea, it feels different. There is a sense of intimacy to it, because puffins do not appear in endless flocks like some other seabirds. They seem almost solitary, appearing in pairs or small groups, scattered among the guillemots and kittiwakes. It is this sense of rarity that makes seeing one so special. But to truly understand the puffin, you have to follow its life through the seasons. For much of the year, these birds are almost invisible to us. They spend their winters out at sea, often miles from land, in the gray, churning waters of the North Atlantic. Alone, or in small groups, they bob on the rolling swells, facing storms that would overwhelm most creatures. They dive under the surface, using their wings to fly through the water, chasing small fish like sand eels. Down there, in the cold and the dark, they are perfectly at home. And then, as spring approaches, they return to land. It is an ancient rhythm, one repeated for thousands of years. They arrive at their nesting grounds, steep cliffs and grassy slopes that face the sea. Places like Bempton Cliffs, or the islands further north, become alive with them. Their bright bills, which seemed muted during the winter, glow once again. It is as if the bird is putting on its best clothes for the season of renewal. What is striking about puffins is the way they nest. Unlike many seabirds that perch on rocky ledges, puffins dig burrows. Using their beaks and claws, they carve out little tunnels in the earth, sometimes reusing old rabbit warrens. Inside these burrows, they lay a single egg, just one. That alone tells you something about how carefully balanced their survival is. One egg means one chance. Both parents share the duty of incubation, taking turns to guard and warm it. In the quiet darkness of the burrow, life begins, and then comes the challenge of raising the chick. Puffins are extraordinary fishers. They are able to dive deep and return with multiple fish clamped in their beak at once. Sometimes, if you watch closely, you will see one flying back to its burrow with half a dozen silvery sand eels neatly lined up, their heads dangling like a small bouquet of the sea. This ability is one of the puffin's great adaptations, allowing them to feed their young efficiently. But their lives are never easy. In the sea, they face predators like gulls that swoop down to steal their catch, or larger seabirds that drive them away. On land, they must be wary of other animals that might raid their nests. And looming above all these natural dangers is the human impact. The changes to fish stocks due to overfishing, the shifts in sea temperature from climate change, and the disturbance of their habitats. Despite these pressures, puffins have found a way to keep going. Watching them together on the cliffs, you can see the deep bonds they form. Puffins often return to the same partner each year, reuniting after months apart at sea. They greet each other with a ritual known as billing, where they gently knock their brightly colored beaks together. It is a simple gesture, but it feels almost like watching a small celebration of loyalty and survival. There is also something deeply calming about their presence. When you sit quietly by the cliffs, listening to the sound of the waves and the wind, and then see one of these small birds land awkwardly nearby, it pulls you into a slower rhythm of time. You begin to realize how these creatures have endured for thousands of years, not by being strong in the human sense, but by being perfectly suited to their world. In folklore, puffins have long captured human imagination. Their bright beaks and unusual appearance made them symbols of curiosity and oddity. In some communities, they were once hunted for food or for their feathers, but today they are cherished as part of the fragile beauty of the coast. Birdwatchers travel great distances just for the chance to see one, and those who do often describe the encounter as strangely moving, as if the puffin represents something more than itself, a glimpse of nature's humor, resilience, and vulnerability. On the Yorkshire coast, spotting a puffin feels like witnessing a piece of living history. The same cliffs that now host them have seen centuries of human change. Fishing villages have risen and declined, ships have come and gone, wars have passed, but the puffins return each spring, faithfully continuing their ancient cycle. There is comfort in that consistency, a reminder that even as the world shifts, some rhythms endure, and yet it would be misleading to think of them as safe. Puffin numbers in some places have dropped dramatically. Warmer seas have affected the abundance of sand eels, one of their main foods. Storms have become more violent, wiping out entire breeding seasons. It is not just a bird we risk losing, but the living thread that ties together ocean, land, and sky. Still, there is hope. Conservation efforts at reserves like Bempton Cliffs and on remote islands across the North Atlantic are helping protect nesting sites. By limiting disturbances and monitoring populations, we are giving puffins the space to carry on their fragile existence. Each season that they return is a small victory, a quiet reminder that the natural world can endure if given the chance. So when you think of the puffin, picture not just a cheerful little bird with a painted beak, but a survivor of immense challenges. Picture it flying low over the waves, wings beating furiously, body almost skimming the water, heading home to its burrow with a beakful of fish. Picture the way it greets its partner on the cliffs, beaks clicking softly in the summer sun. And picture, too, the way it disappears again into the endless sea, leaving us only with the memory of its presence until the next season arrives. The puffin's life may seem far away from ours, but in many ways it holds lessons for us. It shows that survival often comes not from strength, but from balance, adaptability, and loyalty to the cycles of nature. It reminds us that beauty can exist in small forms, in fleeting moments, in creatures that seem almost too fragile for the world, yet endure because they are exactly what the world needs them to be. On the Yorkshire coast, if you sit patiently enough, you might just see one: bright beak, quick wings, determined flight, and when you do, you will carry with you not just the image of a bird, but the story of survival across centuries, written quietly in the cliffs and the sea. Whitby. When most people hear the name Whitby, they think of the haunting abbey ruins on the cliff, the winding cobbled streets filled with the smell of fish and chips, or perhaps the connection to Bram Stoker's Dracula. But here, in the Scarborough collection, the name Whitby takes on a different form. It's not the town itself that we see, but a pastel work created by the Scottish artist Pat Dothwaite, whose life and art carried an unmistakable boldness that set her apart. Pat Dothwaite, born in 1934, was never someone who followed the traditional paths expected of women in the mid-20th century. In fact, she didn't even begin as a painter. Her early life was steeped in movement, literally. She trained as a dancer and mime artist under the famous Margaret Morris movement in Glasgow, a modernist dance school that blended art, rhythm, and expression, and this beginning shaped her entire approach to painting. Her works often look alive, almost like the figures could step or twist off the page. Even in her pastel Whitby, the town doesn't feel static. Instead, the strokes have a nervous energy, the colors pulse, and the scene has a kind of life force that reflects the way she herself lived. What makes this particular pastel so important is not just the subject, Whitby, but the fact that it belongs to a collection that has historically leaned heavily toward male artists. Scarborough, like many galleries and museums across the country, collected the works of men for decades while overlooking women who were pushing boundaries in equally fascinating ways. By bringing Dothwaite's Whitby into the collection, Scarborough isn't just acquiring an artwork, it's correcting a long-standing imbalance. It's ensuring that future generations don't see only one half of art history. Dothwaite's style was often described as wild, unsettling, even disturbing. Critics sometimes struggled to categorize her work, but that was exactly her strength. She refused to fit neatly into boxes. Her colors could be fierce, her figures grotesque, yet strangely beautiful. There's an honesty in her art, a rawness that doesn't try to flatter. And when you consider Whitby, you start to see that she wasn't painting the place in a literal way. She wasn't making a postcard of the Yorkshire coast. Instead, she was capturing its atmosphere, its spirit, its energy. Whitby in her pastel becomes almost psychological, less about geography, more about how the place feels when you stand on the seafront, when you smell the salt, when you hear the gulls circling above. The decision to add her work to Scarborough's collection also connects to a wider shift happening in museums everywhere. For centuries, the canon of art history was written by men and about men. Women, if they appeared at all, were often subjects rather than creators. But now, galleries are re-evaluating. They're realizing that their walls tell stories, and if those walls only show male perspectives, then half the story of human creativity is missing. By choosing to display artists like Pat Dothwaite, Scarborough is not just filling a gap, it's rewriting what a balanced cultural memory looks like. It's also worth remembering that Dothwaite herself was something of an outsider. Even within the Scottish art world, she never belonged to any single school or movement. She traveled widely, South America, Morocco, India, and you can see those influences in the rhythms of her line, in the intensity of her colors. Yet she also drew inspiration from places close to home. Whitby is a perfect example. It takes a familiar northern English town and filters it through her unrestrained imagination. Now, imagine standing in front of this pastel at Scarborough. At first glance, it might just seem like another coastal piece. But as you linger, you notice the restless energy, the way her hand seems unable to stay still. The pastel doesn't just show Whitby, it becomes Whitby in motion, a town alive with history and atmosphere. And if you think about the artist behind it, you begin to sense how much of herself she poured into her work. Every line feels urgent, every color intentional, as though she wanted to capture something slipping away before it vanished. Dothwaite passed away in 2002, leaving behind a body of work that is still being reassessed today. For many years she was overlooked, partly because her art didn't conform to polite expectations. But now, institutions are beginning to see her for what she was, a fearless artist who challenged norms and gave us an uncompromising vision of the world. The Scarborough Pastel Whitby isn't just a picture of a place, it's a doorway into her world, her energy, her defiance. In many ways, this single acquisition represents a larger story, the story of how museums grow and change, the story of how women artists are finally being given the recognition they deserve, and the story of how a place like Scarborough, known for its seaside cliffs and coastal history, also plays a role in reshaping the cultural landscape of Britain. So when you hear the name Whitby in Scarborough's collection, think beyond the postcard views and Gothic Abbey ruins. Think of Pat Dothwaite, pastel in hand, translating a town into raw emotion. Think of a woman who refused to be boxed in, whose art vibrates with life even decades after her passing. And think of how important it is that her vision is now part of the story Scarborough tells to every visitor who walks through its doors. Knitting sheaths. When we imagine the wind-swept coastlines of Yorkshire, with grey skies rolling in over the North Sea and a crisp chill in the air, it is easy to picture locals bundled up in thick sweaters, scarves, and socks, hand-knitted with care. The connection between this region and the craft of knitting goes back centuries, and hidden within that story is a curious little object, an almost forgotten tool known as the knitting sheath. A knitting sheath was not a decorative trinket, nor simply a functional accessory, but rather a fascinating blend of utility, tradition, and symbolism. These small carved devices, often worn at the waist or tucked into a belt, held one knitting needle steady while the knitter worked with the other. The purpose may sound simple, but in practice, it allowed knitters to work faster, for longer hours, and with greater precision. Imagine a time when knitting was not just a pastime, but a livelihood, with entire communities depending on the production of warm clothing for trade and survival. In such a world, the knitting sheath became an essential tool. Knitting sheaths came in countless shapes and sizes. Some were made from humble wood, carved by hand with a pocket knife during quiet evenings by the fire. Others were beautifully decorated, with etchings, initials, or patterns that told of family histories or carried a personal touch from the craftsman. A few rare examples were even fashioned from bone, antler, or metal, reflecting the resourcefulness of rural communities. But what makes knitting sheaths truly intriguing is not just their practicality, but the culture that surrounded them. For many families, a finely carved sheath could be a courtship gift. A young man might spend weeks perfecting his carving before presenting the finished piece to the woman he hoped to marry. In this sense, the knitting sheath was more than a tool, it was a token of love, skill, and promise. If we pause for a moment, we can picture it. A Yorkshire cottage, with the glow of firelight flickering against the stone walls, the soft rhythm of knitting needles clicking together, and a wooden sheath securing the work. These small devices were not mass-produced, but handcrafted, and each one carried with it a personal story. Some museums today hold collections of knitting sheaths, preserving them as a reminder of a craft-based economy that has largely vanished. Visitors often marvel at how small and unassuming they look. yet these objects once played a role in sustaining entire families. For the knitters of Yorkshire, speed was everything. Sweaters and stockings were not only worn by local fishermen and farmers, but also exported as valuable goods. The faster one could knit, the more income could be earned, and the knitting sheath gave an edge in that race against time. There is also a symbolic layer here, tied to identity and tradition. Knitting itself became part of the cultural fabric of Yorkshire's coastal communities. The patterns, stitches, and garments often carried regional variations, passed down through generations. The sheath, as a companion to that craft, became a silent witness to countless hours of work, conversation, and care. By the mid-19th century, however, knitting sheaths began to fade from use. The arrival of mechanized knitting machines changed everything. Hand knitting, once a vital trade, became more of a domestic or leisure activity. As industries shifted, so too did the tools. The sheath, once indispensable, became a relic, yet its memory lingers, a quiet reminder of how deeply human ingenuity and artistry are tied to survival and comfort. Today, collectors and historians often describe knitting sheaths as little masterpieces of folk art. Each is unique, reflecting the hands that shaped it and the stories it belonged to. Some were carved with symbols of faith, like crosses or hearts, while others carried geometric patterns or initials, almost like secret signatures. A few even incorporated whimsical shapes, perhaps intended to bring luck or joy to the knitter. And so, when we think of wrapping ourselves in warm sweaters and socks during a cold Yorkshire winter, it is worth remembering the unseen tools that made such comforts possible. The knitting sheath is one such tool, quietly bridging the practical with the personal, the functional with the symbolic. It connects us to a time when every stitch carried meaning, and every object had a story. As we let this story settle, it reminds us of the ways in which even the smallest objects can hold within them an entire world of history and culture. The knitting sheath may have disappeared from everyday life, but its spirit survives in the warmth of handmade clothing, in the patience of craft, and in the memory of communities that once depended on such humble devices to face the cold winds of the sea. Speeton plesiosaur. Along the rugged Yorkshire coast where the cliffs rise sharply above the restless sea, the land has long concealed secrets that date back tens of millions of years. The winds here are brisk, the waves relentless, and the layers of rock that line the shore are like pages of an ancient book, each stratum holding fragments of a world long vanished. It was in this dramatic landscape, not far from the small village of Speeton, that a remarkable discovery was made. A fossil, partly hidden in the weathered rock, caught the attention of paleontologists. At first glance it appeared to be the remains of a plesiosaur, a marine reptile from the Mesozoic era. But as the details unfolded, it became clear that this find was not just another specimen. It was something that could change the way scientists understand the evolution of these extraordinary creatures. The plesiosaur was a remarkable predator of the seas. With its long serpentine neck, compact body, and powerful flippers, it was perfectly adapted for life in the oceans that covered much of the Earth during the age of dinosaurs. Yet, while many plesiosaurs have been unearthed across Europe, North America, and beyond, one period in their evolutionary story has remained shrouded in mystery. The Lower Cretaceous period, spanning roughly 145 to 100 million years ago, has yielded surprisingly few plesiosaur fossils. For decades, paleontologists have puzzled over this gap. Did plesiosaurs decline during this time? Were they evolving into new forms we have yet to recognize? Or is it simply that the fossil record has not preserved their story? The Speeton plesiosaur offers a tantalizing clue. The fossil itself is embedded in chalky rock that dates back to the Lower Cretaceous. Its bones, though fragmented and weathered by time, are enough to suggest that this animal does not match neatly with any known species. Instead, it seems to represent something new, an undiscovered branch of the plesiosaur family tree. For paleontologists, this is a rare and exciting opportunity. Every new species discovered adds a piece to the grand puzzle of life on Earth. And in this case, it may fill a gap of nearly 60 million years in the evolutionary record of these marine reptiles. Imagine for a moment the oceans of the Lower Cretaceous. Britain, as we know it today, did not exist in the same form. Much of the land was covered by warm, shallow seas teeming with life. Ammonites, with their coiled shells, drifted through the water. Belemnites, ancient relatives of squid, darted in schools. And above them, swift-moving fish and marine reptiles hunted with precision. The Speeton plesiosaur would have been part of this thriving ecosystem. With its long neck extending gracefully through the water, it could strike at unsuspecting prey, snapping up fish or squid with its sharp teeth. Its flippers propelled it with remarkable agility, allowing it to maneuver with ease through the currents. But what makes this specimen truly extraordinary is not just its anatomy, but its timing. The fossil record is like a film reel, with missing frames. We can see plesiosaurs flourishing in the Jurassic period. We can see them again in the late Cretaceous near the end of their reign. Yet in the early chapters of the Cretaceous, the reel goes strangely blank. The Speeton plesiosaur may be one of those missing frames, bridging the gap between earlier and later forms. For paleontologists, that means rewriting part of the plesiosaur story. It means asking new questions. What adaptations were plesiosaurs developing at this time? How were they responding to changes in climate, sea levels, and ecosystems? And how did these changes shape their survival for millions of years to come? The discovery itself was not a simple one. Fossils along the Yorkshire coast are often uncovered by chance, exposed after storms batter the cliffs or after tides eat away at the shoreline. In this case, fragments of bone protruding from the chalky cliffs sparked interest. Paleontologists worked carefully, using tools to chip away at the surrounding rock, preserving each piece with painstaking attention. Even small fragments can tell a story. The curve of a rib, the shape of a flipper bone, the structure of a vertebra. Combined, they can reveal not only what kind of animal this was, but how it lived, moved, and evolved. As the analysis of the Speeton plesiosaur continues, paleontologists are already considering its broader implications. Lower Cretaceous plesiosaurs are incredibly rare across the globe. That means every new specimen carries outsized importance. This discovery may not just be about one animal, it may reshape our understanding of an entire group. For example, if this species shows traits that bridge older Jurassic plesiosaurs with later Cretaceous ones, it could illuminate the evolutionary pathway that allowed these creatures to thrive for millions of years. The public fascination with plesiosaurs often circles back to myths and legends. In the popular imagination, these marine reptiles are sometimes linked with stories of sea serpents or even the Loch Ness Monster. While those connections are speculative at best, they show the enduring power these creatures have in capturing human imagination. The Speeton plesiosaur reminds us that these were not mythical beasts, but real animals that once ruled the oceans. Their fossils are not just curiosities, they are windows into worlds we can only begin to reconstruct. Standing on the cliffs of Speeton, it is humbling to think about the vastness of time. The waves crash endlessly below, eroding the rock layer by layer, slowly revealing traces of lives long gone. To hold a fragment of bone from a creature that swam here 120 million years ago is to feel a direct connection across eons. It is a reminder of how much we have learned, and how much we have yet to uncover. The Speeton plesiosaur may eventually be named and classified as a new species. If so, its name will forever link it to the quiet village and the dramatic cliffs where it was found. But beyond names and classifications, its real importance lies in the questions it raises. Evolutionary gaps are like unsolved mysteries, and every fossil has the potential to provide answers. For the plesiosaurs, this specimen may be the missing page that explains how they endured, adapted, and thrived during a period that has puzzled scientists for decades. For those listening now, perhaps drifting into sleep as the story unfolds, imagine the scene not as words on a page, but as life itself. Imagine descending beneath the waves of the lower Cretaceous sea. The light filters down from above, shimmering through the water. Shadows of ammonites drift by, their shells gleaming faintly. A school of fish darts suddenly, disturbed by something moving with quiet power. Out of the gloom, a long neck glides forward, the head turning slightly as jaws snap shut on prey. Flippers beat in steady rhythm, propelling the creature effortlessly. It is a glimpse of a world that existed long before ours, and yet still feels strangely close when you listen to the bones. The Speeton plesiosaur is not just a fossil, it is a reminder of deep time, of oceans that no longer exist, and of creatures whose lives shaped the history of our planet. And while much about it remains uncertain, its exact species, its full anatomy, its role in the ecosystem, what is certain is that its discovery has opened a new window into the past. In the years to come, as further research unfolds, the story of this marine reptile will grow clearer. But for now, it remains a tantalizing mystery, half hidden in the cliffs of Yorkshire, waiting for us to piece its story together. The Barrington Island tortoise. When scientists first examined the curious shell and skeletal remains of a tortoise discovered on Barrington Island, part of the Galapagos, they did not realize they were holding what might be the only surviving evidence of an entire extinct species. At first glance, it looked like a typical giant tortoise, one of many that roamed across the islands. But upon closer study, its features stood apart: the shape of its carapace, the curve of its scutes, and even the proportions of its limbs. This specimen was unlike any other, and soon it was suggested that it represented the last trace of the Barrington Island tortoise, a form thought to be lost forever. The Galapagos Islands are often described as a living laboratory of evolution. Spread across the Pacific Ocean, each island hosts its own unique ecosystem, shaped by isolation, volcanic landscapes, and subtle differences in climate. Among the most famous inhabitants are the giant tortoises, creatures that fascinated Charles Darwin during his voyage on the HMS Beagle. It was from studying these animals that Darwin recognized how species could diverge and adapt depending on their environment. Barrington Island, known today as Santa Fe Island, is a rugged rocky place with limited vegetation. Unlike the lush greenery of some of the larger islands, Santa Fe's landscape is dominated by arid scrub, cacti, and sparse patches of greenery. It was in this harsh and unforgiving environment that a unique species of tortoise once thrived. These creatures were believed to have adapted specifically to the limited resources of the island. Their shells, for example, were shaped in ways that allowed them to stretch upward and feed on cactus pads, a vital source of both food and water. The story of the Barrington Island tortoise is not just about biology, it is also a story of disappearance. For centuries, sailors visited the Galapagos Islands, and unfortunately, they often hunted tortoises for food. These animals could survive for months without water or food, making them an ideal source of fresh meat during long voyages. As a result, tens of thousands of tortoises across the islands were taken and consumed. Some species never recovered, others dwindled until only a handful of individuals remained. On Santa Fe Island, it is believed the Barrington tortoise was wiped out entirely before scientists could properly study it. The specimen in question, long preserved in museum collections, may represent the only physical record of the species. Its survival is both a blessing and a haunting reminder of how fragile island ecosystems can be. Imagine holding a shell that once carried the weight of a living creature, knowing that the bloodline that produced it has ended forever. To scientists, this is not simply a relic of the past. It is a critical puzzle piece that helps reconstruct the lost biodiversity of the Galapagos. What makes this specimen especially valuable is that it may fill a gap in our understanding of giant tortoise evolution. Each island's tortoise population shows subtle differences, from the dome-shaped shells of some species to the saddle-backed forms of others. These variations tell us how species adapted to their environment. But without the Barrington Island tortoise, the evolutionary map remains incomplete. This single specimen, carefully studied, could help bridge that gap. To appreciate the significance, let's step back and think about how tortoises arrived in the Galapagos in the first place. Giant tortoises are not native to the islands. They most likely drifted there, carried by ocean currents from South America. A small number of tortoises may have washed ashore on different islands, and over time their descendants evolved into distinct populations. Each island became a cradle for new forms of life. On larger, greener islands, tortoises developed dome-shaped shells to browse on grass and low plants. On drier, harsher islands like Santa Fe, they developed saddleback shells, which allowed them to stretch their necks higher and survive on tougher vegetation. The Barrington Island tortoise was part of this evolutionary story. Without it, the picture is incomplete, like a missing page in a history book. Scientists today look back with frustration and regret, wishing that more specimens had been preserved. If even a handful of living individuals had survived, perhaps breeding programs could have saved the species. But with only one specimen known, the extinction appears final, and yet, there is still a spark of hope. The Galapagos Islands have surprised scientists before. Tortoise species once thought extinct have occasionally been rediscovered. On Fernandina Island, for instance, a lone female tortoise was found after more than a century of assumed extinction. Genetic studies later confirmed she belonged to a species long considered lost. Could the same be true for the Barrington Island tortoise? Could there be a hidden survivor somewhere on Santa Fe, living unnoticed in the rocky terrain? So far, searches have turned up no living individuals. The ecosystem of Santa Fe today is dominated by land iguanas and sparse vegetation, and the tortoise remains absent. Still, conservationists are not without options. In recent years, efforts have been made to restore tortoise populations on islands where they have disappeared. On Santa Fe, conservationists introduced tortoises from nearby Espanola Island to serve as ecological replacements. These tortoises help restore the balance of the ecosystem by spreading seeds and shaping vegetation, much like the Barrington Island tortoise once did. This raises an intriguing question. If the Barrington Island tortoise is truly gone, can its role in the ecosystem still be preserved, even if by another species? Some argue that while genetic purity may be lost, the ecological function is just as important. Others hold out hope that fragments of DNA from the specimen might one day allow for a form of revival. With modern techniques in genetics and cloning, the idea of bringing back extinct species has shifted from fantasy to scientific possibility. Could the Barrington tortoise one day walk the rocky slopes of Santa Fe again, resurrected through its preserved remains? Beyond the scientific implications, the story of this tortoise speaks to the fragility of life on islands. Isolation creates unique and fascinating species, but it also makes them vulnerable. A single human action, like the harvesting of tortoises by sailors, can destroy what took thousands of years to evolve. The Barrington Island tortoise is not just a lost animal. It is a symbol of how quickly and permanently humans can alter the natural world. For researchers, the specimen is more than just a shell. it is a reminder of responsibility. Every extinct species leaves behind unanswered questions. What exactly did it eat? How did it behave? How did it interact with the environment and other creatures? With the Barrington tortoise, many of these questions will never be answered. What remains is a shell, silent but powerful in its message. Imagine walking through the barren landscape of Santa Fe Island. The rocks are sun-baked, the cacti stand tall, and the air is dry. You see land iguanas scurrying between stones, but no tortoises. The silence feels heavier when you remember that once, great lumbering tortoises roamed here, shaping the land with their slow, deliberate movements. To know that they are gone forever creates a kind of haunting presence, an absence that feels almost physical. And yet within that absence lies knowledge. The single specimen of the Barrington tortoise, carefully preserved in collections, allows us to imagine what was once here. It gives scientists the ability to trace connections, to understand the past, and perhaps to better protect what remains. In the end, the specimen is not only valuable to science, but also to our shared understanding of life and loss. The Barrington Island tortoise may never return, but its legacy endures. Its story is a lesson in the importance of conservation, the cost of neglect, and the urgency of protecting species before they vanish. Every shell, every bone, every trace matters, and in this one tortoise, the last of its kind, we see both the fragility and resilience of nature. Pancake bell. There are objects in history that may seem small, ordinary, or even mundane at first glance, yet when we pause and look closer, they open a window into the rhythm of life centuries ago. The pancake bell is one such object. At first it might appear to be just another bell, a piece of iron or bronze that once hung in a church tower or a town square. But its story is tied to daily life, to food, to rituals, and even to the way people measured the passage of time before the age of wristwatches and digital clocks. The pancake bell was not just any bell. It served as a curfew bell, rung every single day at 6 in the morning and again at 6 in the evening. Its sound carried across towns and villages, signaling the start and end of the day for ordinary people. Imagine a time when not everyone could afford a clock, when the rising and setting of the sun was still the most reliable guide, and yet the striking sound of a bell provided a structure that brought the community together in a shared rhythm. For villagers, workers, and housewives alike, the ringing at 6 was more than noise. It was a command. It was a reminder. It was the invisible thread that tied people's days together. But the bell had another role, one that linked it to celebration, food, and the anticipation of a feast. On one particular day each year, Shrove Tuesday, the bell was rung at noon. This ringing was different. It wasn't about starting or ending the day. It was about announcing a change of pace, a ritual that had been repeated for generations. This noon ringing meant that housewives could now begin to prepare pancakes. It was not simply a practical reminder, it was a joyful signal. The moment people heard that midday sound, kitchens would come alive with the crackling of butter, the mixing of batter, and the sweet warm smell of pancakes wafting through small medieval houses. This custom may sound quaint, but in truth it was deeply tied to the traditions of Lent, the period of fasting that followed Shrove Tuesday. In households across England, this day became a chance to use up rich foods like eggs, milk, and flour before the strict season of abstinence began. The bell was, in a sense, a countdown to simplicity, a call to enjoy what you had before 40 days of restraint. And so, the pancake bell became a bridge between daily life, community celebration, and religious tradition. Think for a moment about the sound of such a bell. Its ringing would echo across cobbled streets, over fields, through smoke rising from hearths. People would stop, perhaps mid-task, to listen. Housewives would smile knowingly. Children might rush indoors with excitement, and the entire town would feel that same shared anticipation. Unlike today, where time slips by in the background hum of machines and screens, time then was loud, sharp, and communal. It was something you heard, not just something you saw on a device. If you picture the bell itself, it might be smaller than the grand church bells we often imagine. Perhaps it was hung in a modest wooden frame. Perhaps it bore marks of age, its surface darkened by weather and smoke. Every strike against its metal would not only carry sound but also tradition, an audible reminder of how life was ordered. The pancake bell tells us something important, that even the most ordinary objects can carry meaning when placed in the context of human routine and celebration. Over the centuries, this tradition faded in many places. With the rise of clocks, with shifts in religious observance, and with changing rhythms of daily work, the bell's practical necessity diminished. Yet in some towns and parishes, the pancake bell is still remembered, even rung ceremonially on Shrove Tuesday to honor that link with the past. Those who hear it today might smile at the quaintness, but if they close their eyes, they might imagine what it was like to hear it long ago, when its call meant so much more. The bell's significance goes beyond pancakes. It reflects the way communities once lived in sync with sound. Bells told people when to rise, when to work, when to stop, when to pray, and when to feast. In a way, bells were the heartbeat of medieval towns. Without bells, silence might have meant confusion or even fear. With bells, life had rhythm. The pancake bell is simply one expression of this larger pattern, a reminder that sound was once the great organizer of human life. As we reflect on it now, it is fascinating to see how such a small custom ringing at noon on one specific day could be remembered for centuries. It speaks to the power of tradition, of repetition, of tying everyday acts like cooking to larger cycles of faith and culture. For those who lived in that time, the pancake bell was not trivial. It was the sound of comfort, of familiarity, of shared identity. So when we think of this bell today, we're not just thinking about a piece of metal or an odd custom. We're thinking about a world where time was heard, where food and faith intertwined, where the smallest of rituals carried meaning far beyond themselves. The pancake bell is a reminder that history isn't only written in grand monuments or battles, but in the sound of something as humble as a bell calling people to make pancakes. Pair of bronze arms. There are objects in museums that hold historical weight because of the era they come from, the rulers they once served, or the civilizations they represent. Then there are others whose value lies not in antiquity but in artistic expression, pieces that embody human creativity, memory, and emotion. The sculpture known as the pair of bronze arms is one of those pieces. It may not be an ancient relic pulled from the ruins of a forgotten city, but it is deeply significant in the story of art and remembrance. Created by the sculptor Kathleen Scott, it carries with it not only artistic merit but also the quiet echo of personal history, love, and loss. At first glance it is simple, two outstretched bronze arms, cast in such a way that they appear both strong and delicate. Yet as you look closer you realize that these arms seem to reach beyond the bronze itself. They are not merely static forms, but gestures frozen in time. They feel as though they belong to someone we could have known, someone who lived, loved, and perhaps longed for something that could never be returned. In this way, Scott's work bridges art with memory. Kathleen Scott herself was no ordinary sculptor. Born in the late 19th century, she lived through an era of change, tragedy, and discovery. But most importantly, she was the widow of the polar explorer Captain Robert Falcon Scott, the man who led the ill-fated Terra Nova expedition to the South Pole. His story is one of the most famous in the history of exploration. He and his men reached the pole in 1912, only to find that they had been beaten there by Roald Amundsen's Norwegian team. On their grueling return journey, weakened by frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion, they perished in the icy wilderness. Scott's final diary entries, filled with stoic courage and sorrow, would become legendary. Kathleen, left behind in England, turned to her art to process her grief. Through sculpture, she gave form to emotions that words alone could never capture. Many of her works were tributes, memorials to her husband and his companions, and to the idea of human endurance in the face of impossible odds. The pair of bronze arms emerges from that space of artistic mourning and resilience. Think about what arms symbolize. They are tools of action, of holding, of reaching. They embrace loved ones. They lift burdens. They extend outward into the world. In Kathleen's sculpture, the arms seem almost to reach into emptiness, as though grasping for something just beyond their touch. Perhaps they were meant to suggest her own yearning for her husband, someone she could never hold again. Or perhaps they represent a universal gesture, humanity reaching forward, always striving, always longing. When this sculpture became part of the collection, it was not just as a piece of bronze, it was as a story, a fragment of personal history tied to one of the most poignant moments in the age of exploration. For visitors who know the backstory, the arms carry weight beyond their form. They embody both love and loss, permanence and absence. Kathleen Scott herself deserves recognition as an artist in her own right. Too often she is remembered only as the widow of a great explorer, but her work stands apart. She trained in Paris under Auguste Rodin, one of the most influential sculptors of modern times. From him she learned the ability to imbue static bronze and stone with movement, with energy, with life. You can see Rodin's influence in the pair of bronze arms, in the way the muscles are suggested rather than over-defined, in the tension that seems to radiate from the form. And yet Kathleen's style was not merely borrowed, it was her own. She had a gift for intimacy, for capturing not just the physical but the emotional presence of her subjects. She made portraits, busts, and memorials that still resonate today. In the arms, this intimacy is distilled into something both simple and profound. Imagine yourself walking through a gallery. You pass grand statues, elaborate carvings, and priceless artifacts, and then you come across this sculpture, just two arms, disembodied, reaching. It stops you. It pulls you in. Not because it is grand, but because it is human. It feels personal, almost private, as if you've stumbled into someone's memory. The emotional impact of such a piece is not accidental. Art historians often note how sculptures that fragment the body, just hands or faces or arms, can evoke stronger feelings than full figures. Perhaps it's because the fragment suggests what is missing. We see only a part, and in our minds we fill in the rest, guided by our own experiences of longing or loss. In Kathleen Scott's Bronze Arms, what is absent speaks just as loudly as what is present. For more than a century, this work has been admired, not for its scale or grandeur, but for its quiet power. It shows us how art can serve as a bridge between personal grief and collective memory. To Kathleen, these arms may have been tied to her own story, her own mourning, but for those who encounter them now, they become symbols of something larger, the universal experience of reaching for someone or something that is gone. The material itself, bronze, adds another layer to the story. Bronze has been used for millennia, from the weapons of the ancient world to the great statues that stand in public squares today. It is durable, able to survive centuries with only the lightest touch of corrosion. By casting the arms in bronze, Kathleen ensured that they would outlast her own lifetime. In a way, the permanence of the metal stands in sharp contrast to the fleeting nature of human life. Flesh and bone wither, but bronze endures. The arms she sculpted for eternity will still reach out long after generations have passed. And this brings us to an almost haunting thought. The real arms, the living ones she remembered, are gone forever. Captain Scott's body lies buried beneath the Antarctic snow, never recovered. Yet here, in a museum, the bronze arms reach out as if he might still be within their grasp. Art preserves what reality cannot. As you let your mind drift with this idea, the sculpture becomes less about its material presence and more about what it evokes. You can almost feel the weight of history pressing against it, the story of exploration, of love, of grief, of the human need to leave something behind. That is the hidden power of the pair of bronze arms. It is not just art, it is memory made solid. The longer you linger with it, the quieter your thoughts become. You begin to sense the stillness in the gesture, the eternal pause captured in bronze. It invites reflection. It invites you to slow down. And in that slowing, you connect not only with Kathleen Scott, but with the countless others who have known longing, who have reached out for something they could not touch. This is the legacy of the sculpture. Not fame, not grandeur, but a whisper that endures across time. So the next time you find yourself before a piece like this, whether it be the pair of bronze arms or some other fragment of human creativity, pause for a while. Let it speak to you, because in the silence of bronze, in the simple reach of a pair of arms, there is a story that does not fade. The racing trophy. In the quiet stillness of Scarborough's coastline, where sea breezes drift across the rolling Yorkshire hills, there lies a story of silver, horses, and the thrill of competition. Not just any competition, but one that drew entire communities together, their hearts pounding with anticipation as hooves thundered across the racecourse. The object at the center of this story is a gleaming trophy, a magnificent piece of silverwork, given to the victor of the Scarborough races in the year 1850. This was no ordinary gift. The trophy was presented by none other than Lord Londesborough, the founder of the races, a man who envisioned Scarborough not only as a coastal retreat, but also as a place where society could gather, celebrate, and take part in great spectacles. And so, in 1850, when he handed over this trophy to the winning rider, he wasn't simply rewarding a race. He was marking the beginning of a tradition, one that combines sport, status, and craftsmanship. The racing trophy itself is as much a work of art as it is a symbol of victory. It is finely crafted silver, designed not only to impress the eye, but to embody prestige. Silver, after all, has always carried a special aura. Unlike gold, which symbolizes ultimate wealth, silver has long been associated with elegance, sophistication, and respectability. In the 19th century, a large silver trophy was no small gesture. It was expensive, gleaming proof of importance, a centerpiece that the winner would proudly display in their home for years. But this story isn't just about silver, it's about the atmosphere of Scarborough in the mid-1800s. Imagine it, crowds gathered near the racecourse, men in tall hats and women in flowing dresses, their parasols shading them from the afternoon sun. Excitement hung in the air, mixed with the scent of the sea drifting inland. Horses stamped the ground, their breath visible in the cool air. Riders adjusting saddles, hearts racing just as fast as their mounts. The Scarborough races weren't just about sport, they were a social event. Families came not only to see who won, but to be part of something larger. For many, it was the highlight of the season, an excuse to gather, converse, and marvel at the spectacle. Lord Londesborough understood this well. By creating the races, he gave Scarborough a new tradition, something that would echo across generations. And at the heart of it was the trophy. When the winning rider lifted it for the first time, it wasn't simply a celebration of speed or skill. It was recognition. It was proof that on that particular day they had achieved greatness. The silver gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting both the pride of the rider and the admiration of the crowd. The trophy carried with it the name of Lord Londesborough, ensuring that his presence lingered long after the cheers faded. And yet, what makes this object so fascinating is not just its beauty or even the race it was tied to. It is the way it connects us to a moment in time. Today, when we see the trophy, polished and preserved, it is more than just metal, it is memory. It is an echo of laughter, of cheers, of the pounding of hooves and the rustle of dresses in the stands. It carries with it the spirit of a community that came together to witness something extraordinary. There is also something deeply human about trophies themselves. Across centuries and cultures, humans have created symbols of victory: cups, statues, shields, crowns. They serve as reminders that we are drawn to competition, to striving for more, to moments of triumph. The Scarborough Trophy is part of that long lineage. Crafted in silver, it whispers the same truth, that recognition matters, that achievements deserve to be marked, and that communities celebrate not only winners, but the stories behind them. If you pause and imagine it now, you can almost hear the distant sound of horses racing across that field. You can feel the tension in the crowd, the sudden eruption of joy as the winner crossed the finish line, and the weight of the silver as it was handed over. The trophy is quiet today, resting safely in its place, but its silence hides a history of noise, of excitement, and of pride. As you drift deeper into thought, consider how many hands must have touched this trophy over the years. How many times it was polished, admired, or pointed out as a symbol of a proud moment. Consider the silver itself, mined and refined, shaped into this form by the hands of skilled craftsmen who never set foot in Scarborough, yet whose work has become part of its story. Even the material carries its own journey, a history of earth and fire, transformed into something enduring. When we step back, we realize that objects like this trophy are more than things to look at. They are vessels of memory, holding within them not only the moments they were part of, but the people who celebrated around them. They are reminders that even in the passing of centuries, joy, pride, and tradition remain constant. The Scarborough Racing Trophy of 1850 may sit quietly now, its surface reflecting light but not voices. Yet if you listen closely, you may still hear the faint echoes of cheers, the excitement of the crowd, and the pride of a rider lifting silver high into the air on a summer afternoon long ago. And in that sense, it has never truly stopped shining. Dr. William Harlan's false teeth. At first glance, a set of false teeth might not seem like the kind of object to stop you in your tracks. They are small, ordinary in shape, and strangely familiar. Yet when you realize these belong to Dr. William Harland, a well-known 19th-century physician in Scarborough, and when you discover what they are actually made from, the story becomes less ordinary and far more unsettling. What looks at first like a practical tool for eating and speaking turns into a strange reminder of how people once lived, and even how they treated the human body. These teeth are not made from porcelain or modern resin, as we would expect today. They are in fact fashioned from real human teeth. Imagine that, someone else's teeth, taken from a mouth that once belonged to another living person, carefully reshaped and set into a denture so Dr. Harland could continue his practice and social life. The thought is both fascinating and disturbing. It tells us not only about medical practices of the time, but also about attitudes toward the human body, life, and death. To understand this, we need to step back into the 19th century. Dentistry was still an emerging field. The comfortable, hygienic solutions we know today simply didn't exist. People suffered terribly with tooth decay, infections, and tooth loss, and they were desperate for relief. If you were wealthy, like Dr. Harland, you could afford the best dentistry of the day, and the best often meant real teeth, harvested in ways we might find shocking now. Some were bought from the poor, who might sell their own teeth for money. Others came from cadavers, often the unclaimed dead, or even from the aftermath of battlefields. After conflicts such as the Battle of Waterloo, scavengers collected teeth from the fallen soldiers. These became known as Waterloo teeth, and they were prized for denture making. Imagine the quiet industry of it, rows of teeth from the dead being removed, polished, and resold to become part of someone else's smile. When we look at Dr. Harland's false teeth, we see a glimpse of that hidden economy, a world where poverty, war, and necessity combined to create an unsettling trade in body parts. But it also reminds us how desperate people were to hold on to appearances and dignity. Teeth weren't just about chewing food, they were about social respectability, confidence, and the ability to interact with others without shame. For Dr. Harland, a respected physician, false teeth would have been essential. Imagine him visiting patients, prescribing treatments, and offering advice. His authority and confidence partly depended on how he looked and spoke. In a time when doctors were figures of trust, a gappy smile might undermine the image he needed to maintain. His dentures, strange as they seem to us, were a tool of his profession as much as his stethoscope or his books. There's also something very human in this story. Even the most skilled and knowledgeable people, like Dr. Harland, weren't free from the struggles of the body. They too lost teeth. They too aged, and they too sought ways to cope with those changes. His false teeth remind us that behind the title of doctor was a man with the same vulnerabilities as anyone else. Think of the texture of those dentures, the weight of them in his mouth, the slight strangeness of biting down on something that wasn't truly his own. Did he ever think about the origins of those teeth? Did he ever pause to wonder who they had belonged to before him? Or did practicality silence such thoughts, the way necessity often does? The 19th century was a time of rapid medical advancement, but it was also a time when science often walked hand in hand with the macabre. Anatomy schools used bodies of the poor for dissections, grave robbing fed medical research, and objects like Dr. Harland's dentures were quietly normalized. It's a reminder that progress often comes at unsettling costs. Today, false teeth are created with materials that imitate the natural look of enamel but come from no one but the dentist's workshop. They are clean, safe, and hygienic. We never stop to think about them because they carry no trace of another life. But in Harland's time, the very act of smiling or speaking might carry the ghost of another person's body. It's easy to recoil from this idea, but we should also recognize the resilience and ingenuity of people in the past. They worked with what they had, often under difficult circumstances. Harland's false teeth, as strange as they seem, are a symbol of adaptation, of trying to live with dignity in an era before modern medicine offered easy answers. As we reflect on these dentures, sitting quietly now in a display case, we are reminded that history isn't always grand battles or golden treasures. Sometimes it lies in the intimate, everyday struggles of individuals. A set of false teeth can tell us as much about the human condition as a crown or a sword. They are a bridge between necessity and identity, between the body we are given and the ways we try to hold it together. And so, in this small but powerful object, we glimpse not only Dr. Harland's life, but also the wider story of medicine, class, and human resilience in the 19th century. His teeth, though false, tell a story that is all too real. Bean shells. When you think of the great collectors of history, your mind might immediately leap to kings, explorers, or wealthy patrons who filled their cabinets with the rarest treasures of the earth. But the story I'm about to share is one that belongs not to royalty, not to conquerors, but to a man whose passion for the natural world made him unforgettable. His name was William Bean, a man from Scarborough who in his time was described by one admirer as a very prince of collectors. At first glance, the objects tied to his name might not strike you as grand. They are not crowns, not weapons, not golden ornaments from distant lands. Instead, they are small shells, two particular types of sea snails collected with patience, dedication, and the sharp eye of someone who could find value in what most others would overlook. These are known today as the bean shells, and though they may appear delicate and simple, they carry within them a story that stretches across the scientific world of the 19th century into the rise of natural history as both a science and a passion. Let's slow down and imagine William Bean's world. It is the early 1800s in Scarborough, a seaside town on the rugged Yorkshire coast of England. The waves of the North Sea crash against the shore, the gulls cry overhead, and the people of the town go about their daily lives. Fishermen mending nets, traders selling their goods, children running barefoot across the sand. For most, the beach is simply a source of livelihood, or a place to pass by on the way to somewhere else. But for William Bean, it was a world of endless discovery. Bean was not just a casual shell collector, the sort of person who pockets a few shiny finds from the tide line. He was meticulous, observant, and relentless. He scoured the coastlines, turning over rocks, wading through pools, and combing the sands in search of shells that were not only beautiful but also rare. To him, each shell was not just an ornament, it was evidence, a clue, a fragment of nature's vast puzzle. Among all the shells he collected, two species stood out. They were so distinctive, so rare, that they came to bear his name, the bean shells. Imagine for a moment the feeling of finding something so unusual in the sand, something that had perhaps washed ashore after being carried by the tide for miles. It is small enough to rest on the tip of a finger, delicate enough to shatter if handled carelessly, yet significant enough to eventually earn a place in natural history. Why did people admire William Bean so much? Because he embodied a kind of curiosity and devotion that defined the age. The 19th century was a time of great hunger for knowledge. Museums were being filled with specimens. Scholars were classifying plants and animals with a new scientific rigor, and the idea that ordinary people could contribute to the great body of knowledge about the natural world was beginning to take hold. Bean was not a wealthy aristocrat funding expeditions across oceans. He was a man of Scarborough, working with the shorelines and waters he knew so well. His gift was his persistence. Others may have walked the same beaches and overlooked the very shells he picked up, but he had the eye of a true collector, one who could recognize not just beauty, but significance. Imagine him on a quiet morning, long before the crowds had gathered, walking along the damp sand with a basket in hand. The tide has just gone out, leaving behind pools of water that shimmer in the soft light. He kneels, turns over a stone, and there it is, a tiny shell, a little marvel, almost invisible to anyone else. He knows instantly that it's rare. Perhaps his heart even races a little. This shell, fragile as it is, could be something new to science. And this was what gave Bean his reputation. In his lifetime, he contributed not only shells but also fossils and other specimens that enriched collections and deepened understanding of the natural world. His contemporaries, men who themselves were shaping the foundations of modern natural history, recognized his skill and respected him deeply. To call him a prince of collectors was not just a casual phrase. It was an acknowledgement that William Bean was among the very best at what he did. The bean shells, then, are not just objects, they are symbols. Symbols of patience, of curiosity, and of the human ability to find wonder in the smallest corners of existence. Think about it. While some collectors might have sought grand trophies, William Bean built his legacy from things that could fit in the palm of his hand. Now here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Collections like Bean's were not simply private hobbies. In the 19th century, they played a critical role in science. Natural history was not a closed field reserved for academics. It was shaped by amateurs, enthusiasts, and collectors who sent their findings to experts, corresponded with societies, and sometimes even published their own observations. Bean shells, along with countless other specimens he gathered, formed part of this great network of knowledge. One can imagine how his shells might have traveled beyond Scarborough. Perhaps he sent them to a museum in London, or perhaps other collectors came to see them in his home. Maybe they were catalogued in papers, or discussed among societies that debated classifications and species. Each shell, once just an unnoticed fragment of the sea, became part of a larger dialogue about the richness of life on Earth. There's something quietly beautiful about that. It reminds us that history is not only written by kings or generals. Sometimes it is carried forward by people who simply refuse to stop looking. People like William Bean, who walked the same beaches every day, but never lost the ability to see them as new. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost picture his world, the salty air, the cry of seabirds, the rhythm of waves, and a man bending to the shore, searching, always searching. His treasure chest was not filled with gold, but with shells, shells that would carry his name into the centuries that followed. And so the bean shells are more than just two types of sea snails. They are the legacy of a man whose life reminds us that collecting is not just about possession, it is about noticing, preserving, and connecting with the natural world. It is about finding meaning in small things. It is about leaving behind something that tells future generations not just what you found, but who you were. Today, when we look at the bean shells in a collection, we are not just looking at sea snails, we are looking at William Bean himself, at his persistence, his passion, and his way of seeing the world. And maybe that's the true mystery here. How a man with no great wealth, no armies, and no palaces managed to secure a place in history, all because he cared enough to pick up a shell from the sand and recognize its worth. That's the story of William Bean and his shells, a story small in size, but vast in meaning. Aquamanal. In museums, certain objects catch the eye, not because of their size or grandeur, but because of the story they silently hold. One such object is the aquamanal, a vessel shaped like an animal, used in medieval Europe for pouring water. At first glance it looks whimsical, almost playful, but when you pause and look closer, it carries layers of history that tell us about the world that created it. The piece we focus on here is from Scarborough ware, a ceramic tradition well known in England during the medieval period. Scarborough ware itself was widely traded and admired. It was sturdy yet decorative, used by common households but also appreciated in wealthier circles. The aquamanal, in this case, is shaped like a ram. Its body swells with rounded curves, giving it a lifelike presence, while small applied pellets of clay are arranged across the surface, representing tufts of wool. These tiny additions might seem simple, but they transform the vessel from a practical object into something closer to art. Imagine holding it in your hands. It would feel heavier than expected. A solid piece of fired clay designed not only to serve water, but to spark attention. When water was poured from it, whether at a dining table or during ritual hand-washing, the ram shape would turn a simple act into a moment with character. This is the hidden beauty of medieval craftsmanship. Objects were rarely just functional, they were infused with imagination, symbolism, and meaning. The word aquamanal itself comes from the Latin aqua for water, and manus for hand. These vessels were used primarily for washing hands, often before meals or during religious ceremonies. In an age when hygiene was connected to ritual and symbolism, the act of washing was more than just practical. It was tied to purity, respect, and order. To pour water from the head or mouth of an animal-shaped vessel was to bring a touch of the extraordinary into an everyday act. The choice of a ram is intriguing. In many medieval contexts, animals carried symbolic weight. The ram, strong and stubborn, could represent vigor and leadership, but also sacrifice, echoing biblical themes. Medieval society was steeped in layers of meaning. To them, this was not just a jug shaped like a farm animal, it was an object that brought together belief, function, and artistry in a single form. Scarborough ware itself deserves closer attention. Originating from the coastal town of Scarborough in Yorkshire, it became one of the most recognizable ceramic traditions of its time. Its distinct green glaze was admired across England, giving even simple vessels an eye-catching jewel-like surface. The glaze was achieved through copper oxide, creating shades that ranged from pale green to deeper tones, depending on how it fired in the kiln. To medieval eyes, this glossy green finish carried an association with wealth, freshness, and liveliness. Owning Scarborough ware meant more than just having pottery. It meant holding a piece of beauty that reflected the pride of English craftsmanship. Now think about how this aquamanile would have been seen in its own day. Imagine a medieval dining hall. Long wooden tables stretch across the room. Guests sit on benches, cloaked against the draft of the stone walls. Before the meal, servants approach carrying vessels of water. But instead of plain jugs, they bring out this ram-shaped aquamanile. Water pours gracefully from its mouth into waiting basins, allowing each guest to wash their hands. The room is filled with the glow of torchlight, and in that flickering light, the green glaze of the vessel shines almost like emerald. The ordinary act of cleaning becomes ceremonial, framed by the artistry of the vessel itself. Aquamaniles were not unique to Scarborough ware. They existed across Europe, made in bronze, brass, and ceramics. Some took the form of lions, horses, even fantastical creatures like griffins. Each reflected the imagination of the society that created it. But this ram from Scarborough feels especially grounded in the world of medieval England. It connects directly to the animals that grazed the fields, the wool trade that shaped much of the English economy, and the symbolism that tied people's lives to the rhythms of nature and faith. The applied pellets of clay representing wool might seem like a minor detail, but in them lies a small wonder. These were added by hand, one by one, pressed onto the surface before the firing process. Each pellet is an echo of the maker's hand, a mark left behind by someone who lived centuries ago. Through them, we glimpse not just a vessel, but a human touch across time. Today, when you see this aquamanile in a museum, it may look like a curiosity on a shelf. Yet for medieval eyes, it was an object of status, utility, and symbolism. Its survival into our present day is itself remarkable. Clay is fragile. Many vessels broke, shattered, or were discarded. That this piece remains intact allows us to peer into a world where art and life were inseparable. The aquamanile also speaks to a universal truth about human creativity. Across cultures, people have always shaped everyday tools into works of beauty. Whether a carved spoon, a decorated bowl, or a painted pot, there is a desire to elevate the ordinary. The ram aquamanile is one example of this enduring impulse, to make objects that not only serve but inspire. It invites us to ask a deeper question: why animals? Why give vessels the shape of creatures from the natural world? In part, it may have been delight. To see a jug shaped like a ram must have brought smiles to faces, even in solemn moments. But there is also reverence in this choice. Animals were constant companions in medieval life, providing food, clothing, and labor. By shaping vessels into animal forms, people honored their presence, embedding them in daily rituals of sustenance and cleansing. Over time, aquamaniles faded from everyday use, replaced by simpler, more practical designs. Yet their legacy remains strong. In museums, they stand as reminders that even the simplest moments of life, washing hands, pouring water, were once touched by creativity and imagination. The Scarborough ram, with its glossy glaze and textured wool, continues to charm us centuries later. When you stand before it, you are looking not just at pottery, but at the values of a society. You see their humor, their devotion, their artistry. You see a world that found beauty not in separating art from life, but in blending the two seamlessly. The aquamanile asks us to pause, to notice the details, and to appreciate how even the most practical objects can carry stories across time. And perhaps that is the lesson this small ram carries forward. Objects outlast their makers. They become vessels not only of water, but of memory. They remind us that every age leaves behind artifacts that speak, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, of what it valued. This aquamanile, shaped in Scarborough centuries ago, is one of those voices. Soft, steady, and enduring.